Hey my watchers, welcome. Today we are gonna see, what if Harry Potter gained political awareness, started revolution at Hogwarts? Join Patreon for early access exclusive content of Super Op stories. Also contents that's too far for YouTube, you will get 400 content there, please do check that too. Please subscribe this channel, because definitely I will try my best to provide a valuable content for you all. Also check the description to support the original author for this beautiful creation. A light drizzle consumed the meticulously kept lawns of Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The almost identical detached houses towered over the dull gray paving and tarmac road. The clouds swirled ominously overhead, the light cutting rain changing direction, as if it was controlled by a powerful force. Harry stared at the depressing weather from his bedroom window and could only think of his dead godfather Sirius Black. The images of him falling through the veil stuck in his head as if they had been charmed with the permanent sticking spell. It's been a very slow few days since he'd left King's Cross Station and his friends. It almost felt as if that day was a lifetime behind him. Harry closed his eyes and threw himself backwards onto his bed. The springs heaved under his weight as the rackety old bed was on its last legs. Unlike Dudley, Harry wasn't afforded the luxury of a new bed or luxury furniture. He had to make do with whatever was found at the tip. Harry laid his arms out to his side and tried to think of something other than Sirius or the prophecy. "Harry!" shouted the portly Uncle Vernon from the bottom of the stairs. Harry sprang up like a spring as his name reverberated through his head. "Harry, I'd like a word with you," Uncle Vernon shouted, his voice straining as he impatiently awaited Harry's response. Except Harry didn't respond by voice. He merely got off his noisy bed and opened his bedroom door and walked slowly down the stairs, his head aimed squarely at the floor as he came within feet of Uncle Vernon. "Harry," said Uncle Vernon firmly, "this came for you." Uncle Vernon had in his right hand a letter addressed to Harry. He waved it around in front of Harry's face. "I've half a mind to tear it up," Uncle Vernon uttered at Harry with contempt. "But seeing as you have enlisted the aid of others to threaten us, I have no choice but to allow you this luxury," he said, lingering on the word luxury, as if Harry wasn't even deserving of it. Harry looked at the letter and snatched at it like a hawk, his eyes never crossing with his uncle's. He grasped the letter tightly and scuttled back up the stairs as Uncle Vernon watched him. A horrid sneer etched across his face. Harry turned the corner and immediately was out of the watchful eye of his scornful uncle. He held the letter tighter still and bombed into his small, cramped bedroom. He shut the door with his foot and jumped onto his squeaky bed and stared at the letter intently. Harry Potter, for Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He knew immediately who it was from. It was plastered with stamps, a hallmark of the Weasleys attempting to send Muggle mail. It was, however, not as bad as the last letter. There was at least 2 inches of free space on the letter for the address to be scrawled within. Harry held his breath for a moment before opening it. He was hoping with all his might that it was a letter signaling his exit of this place and a summer at the Burrow. After losing his godfather, he wasn't really wanting to be stuck in his lifeless room for 2 months without human contact and with his soul-destroying uncle, aunt, and his bullying cousin Dudley. Harry ripped open the envelope and pulled out the letter and carefully unfolded it, his excitement being controlled just in case he harbored false hopes. He took a deep breath and then began reading. His eyes lit up as he flew through the letter and then reread it again. "Dear Harry, I hope the letter reached you okay. George recommended sending it via Muggle post again as not to offend your uncle and aunt. I hope you've been all right. Have they been treating you well? Anyway, we have good news. You're spending the whole summer with us. We thought that after Sirius leaving us, that it was best you spent the summer with us, as we know how hard it must be for you in that house. Pack all your things and we'll be there to pick you up in a few hours. We're not sure what time, as George is having problems with his new Muggle car. He can't seem to get it started. Anyway, pack your things away and we'll be right with you. Yours sincerely, Molly Weasley. P.S. Don't worry about dinner." A huge grin stretched across Harry's face as he dropped the letter onto the bed, images of Ron, Ginny, and Mr. and Mrs. Weasley thundering through his head. After losing Sirius, this was exactly what he needed. It made him warm inside as he forgot about Sirius for a moment and glowed at the thought of the summer ahead. Harry sat down on his bed and let his mind float away into a world of laughter and happiness. He was with his friends far away from Privet Drive and the torture that came with it. After several moments lost on a wave of excitement and giddiness, Harry suddenly sat up and realized that he was still in his uncle and aunt's home, and that Uncle Vernon would be wanting to find out what the letter was about, and soon. Harry decided that the only sensible way to approach this would be to take it on headfirst and go see Uncle Vernon with the letter and not allow Uncle Vernon the time to build up his anger, and then unleash it. Harry picked up the letter and slowly made his way downstairs into the sterile world of which Aunt Petunia had created and of which was seemingly the only way the Dursleys could live. Harry walked slowly down the carpeted stairs and turned into the hallway to see Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia arguing in the spotlessly clean kitchen. Aunt Petunia looked flustered and Uncle Vernon had a look of rage emblazoned across his face. Harry paused for a moment in the hallway, his hand grasping the letter still as he watched them argue. He didn't move an inch until Uncle Vernon stopped and turned to look at him. His eyes stared at Harry as if he was some circus freak show. "Yes," said Uncle Vernon sharply. His body now turned completely towards Harry. His hands held in front of his chest, crossed. Said a nervous Harry. He'd never come to let his uncle and aunt read one of his letters before. It wasn't something he was particularly enthused about. "I think you better know what the letter said." "Well, Harry, spit it out," was Uncle Vernon's blunt reply. He wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, and he especially had no time for Harry. "Well, the Weasleys are coming to pick me up and take me away for the summer," said Harry with a tinge of defiance in his voice. He'd been waiting to spend the whole summer away from the Dursleys for as long as he could remember. Harry looked at Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia with bated breath. He was expecting Uncle Vernon to explode like Mount Vesuvius and for Aunt Petunia and look on him with those scornful, piercing eyes and cast some ill-thought judgment upon the Weasleys. Except nothing like that happened. In the moments following his announcement, both of them seemed almost indifferent. It was a strange situation for Harry to behold. "Fine," came the late reply from Uncle Vernon. Harry looked confused. This wasn't the reaction he'd had in mind, and it certainly didn't seem like the Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia that he knows. He stood for a brief moment before turning on the calm demeanors of Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon, and began the slow ascension back to his tiny bedroom. With every step, Harry thought to himself, why didn't they make a big deal of it? What exactly was it that made both Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia seem so subdued? It was like an itch you can't reach. Harry just couldn't figure it out, no matter what ideas and theories shot through his head. None of them could explain it, and none of them seemed even plausible. Harry pushed open the door and dragged himself into the room. He sat himself on the end of his haggardly old bed. He looked back out of his window at the dismal weather and sighed. As much as he was looking forward to leaving with the Weasleys, he just couldn't bear another second in this house. He also was hoping that he wasn't returning to Grimmauld Place. As much as he preferred to be there, he really didn't want to be in a place that reminded him of Sirius. Since Sirius' death, Harry had felt like a part of him died with it and hadn't been able to sleep properly nor go any large amounts of time without Sirius' face popping up in his head. He tried valiantly to put on a brave face, but deep inside he was ravaged with grief. Harry lowered his head on the rough blanket strewn across his bed and slowly closed his eyes, his mind drifting from the world around him and into the land of his dreams. Harry awoke with a startle. He rose to a seated position swiftly and stared out of the window. It's still light out, he thought to himself. He rubbed his eyes with his hands and moved himself to the side of the bed and looked over at Hedwig's empty cage. She was out hunting still. He closed his eyes momentarily and got to his feet. He stretched out his arms and walked over to his trunk and opened it up to reveal a complete mess. He hadn't unpacked it properly since he got back from Hogwarts and obviously wasn't going to be unpacking it properly here. Harry picked up a pile of hand-me-down clothes that were lying next to the trunk and haphazardly packed them into the trunk. He stuffed them in with no cause for tidiness or organization. He wasn't in the mindset to be doing things neatly. Harry paused for a moment as he looked at the book of curses and counter-curses. It was still open from 2 nights ago, when Harry was casually reading it, perusing for more curses for Dumbledore's army. Harry let out a proud smile as memories of the DA meetings ran through his head. It made him proud to think he'd taught them all these curses and that this year, he'll be able to continue doing so. Harry closed the book and placed it within the trunk and stepped back and looked at his rather shabby handiwork. He was surprisingly happy with it in a teenage I've never been one for tidiness kind of way. Harry turned and made his way downstairs and into the meticulously clean lounge. The glass ornaments glimmered on the mantelpiece as Harry stood in the doorway and snarled at Dudley, who was sat watching the 100 Greatest Boxing Massacres on video. Dudley turned and did the typical thug sign for war, cracking his knuckles in his hand. Harry just stood strong and greeted him back with a wry grin, his right hand clutching the wand in the side pocket of his oversized tatty jeans. "One of these days I'm going to pound you into the ground," uttered Dudley in his deep thuggish voice. Harry leaned forward over the side of the sofa and under his jumper aimed the wand at Dudley. "Oh Dudley, don't forget I could magic you into a toad whenever I pleased." Dudley immediately went white and stiffened up like he'd been hit with the Petrificus totalis curse. Harry let out a short chuckle and stood up straight again. "Harry," said Aunt Petunia, who was standing behind Harry. Harry turned suddenly to see Aunt Petunia stood with a sympathetic look on her face. "Can we have a word?" Confusion gripped Harry. What did Aunt Petunia mean by "can we have a word"? What on earth could it be about? Harry pondered these thoughts as he followed Aunt Petunia into the conservatory and was directed to a solitary seat at the dark brown mahogany dining table. Standing, facing the French windows, was Uncle Vernon, his eyes scanning the outside world as Aunt Petunia sat herself down opposite Harry. After a moment, Uncle Vernon turned around and stared diligently at Harry as Aunt Petunia began. "Harry, we hoped we'd never have to tell you this, but well," Aunt Petunia softly said, her usual piercing voice being replaced with a much softer and compassionate one. "It's time. Dumbledore feels you should know." Harry perked up in his seat. He hadn't expected Aunt Petunia to ever utter Dumbledore's name, and what surprised Harry most was that there was no reply from Uncle Vernon telling Aunt Petunia never to speak that name in this house. Harry didn't know what to say or think, but he had to ask. "What does Professor Dumbledore want me to know?" said Harry firmly, his voice cutting through Aunt Petunia almost like a hot knife through butter. Aunt Petunia hesitated for a moment and looked at Uncle as if asking for him to help, but he merely shrugged her off and continued to stare at Harry. "Well," she said nervously, "it's hard to put into words. For so long we tried to scare it out of you. For so long we didn't want anything to do with it. We wanted to rid you of it, but he reminded me why we had to keep you." Harry didn't reply. He felt no need to. Aunt Petunia was going to say what she was going to say and needed no goading from Harry to get on with it. Harry was willing to wait as long as it took to hear what she had to say. Aunt Petunia was about to begin speaking again when a loud knock came from the front door. Uncle Vernon immediately darted from his spot watching Harry and answered the door. Harry listened closely. He knew exactly who it was, and he somehow knew that he wouldn't be hearing what Aunt Petunia was going to say. Well, not tonight at least. Uncle Vernon could be heard loudly talking with distaste in his voice, one of superiority over lower classes, and with that Harry knew exactly who had arrived. It was the Weasleys. Harry jumped from his seat and ran through to the hallway to see Mrs. and Mr. Weasley stood in conversation with Uncle Vernon, and Ron stood in the middle of the hallway looking for something or someone. The moment Harry came into view, Ron looked up and let out a huge cheesy grin. "How are you doing, Harry?" said Ron simply. He was never one to make overblown hellos. He preferred the more understated affair of a simple hello and "How are you? We've come to get you." Harry smiled and walked towards Ron. "Yeah, I got the letter. So how's the burrow these days?" was Harry's response. It too wasn't overblown like that of Hermione or Mrs. Weasley, but it was enough. Ron let slip a cheeky grin and whispered into Harry's ear, "We're not at the burrow this summer." Again. Harry didn't know whether to smile or frown. He'd liked being at the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix, but then he also didn't want to be around a place which reminded him of Sirius. It was a double-edged sword. Harry never had a chance in fending off Mrs. Weasley. She dragged him into her arms and crushed him with one of her renowned hugs. "Oh, Harry, we did miss you." She released a still shocked Harry and looked at him whilst fluffing his hair with her left hand. "Oh, Harry, you still look peaky. We best give you a proper meal for once," she said lovingly. Mr. Weasley walked over to Harry and placed a fatherly-like hand on his shoulder. "Good to see you, Harry. We'd hoped you'd spend the summer with all of us, but we needed the go-ahead first." Harry was filled with warmth and delight. He'd hoped with all his heart that he'd spend the whole summer with the Weasleys, and though Dumbledore had said he needed to spend some time with the Dursleys, he still hoped it was a short stay. "Ron, why don't you help Harry pack his things and bring them down? Molly and I need a word with the Dursleys," said Mr. Weasley in a very businesslike way. Harry and Ron ran up the stairs as fast as they could as Mr. and Mrs. Weasley stepped into the kitchen with Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia. Harry barreled into his bedroom first and Ron followed immediately after. Ron slipped and cannonied into Harry and both of them flew onto the bed. They both exploded with laughter and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling and laughing at the accident. Ron stopped laughing first and sat upright. "Harry, you'll never guess what?" was Harry's quick-fire response. "Mum taught me this cool trick with the wand. It's great." Harry looked at him and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Ron, when did you ever find something your mum has taught you is cool?" Ron looked at him as if Harry had said something so offensive. It needed a teacher-like look of disappointment. "No, really, you have to check this out, watch." Ron jumped up off the bed and pulled his wand out. He aimed it at the trunk and with a single motion swung towards the door. The trunk followed the wand and smashed into the side of the old wardrobe next to the door and fell to the floor. Harry immediately fell back onto the bed laughing as Ron stared at the trunk in disbelief. "That wasn't supposed to happen," Ron said, trying to make Harry believe him. Harry didn't do anything but continue laughing. It was a change for Harry to be laughing so much during the summer. Normally he'd be cooped up alone with no hope of laughter, and this was a refreshing change. After a minute or so Harry stopped laughing and joined Ron stood by the bed. He smiled at Ron and both of them didn't speak but rather did the job they'd come up to do, and carry Harry's things downstairs. Harry took care of Hedwig's cage and his Firebolt 3000 broom. Ron, of course, struggled with Harry's trunk. They both trudged down the stairs with the things. While Harry trudged, Ron was dragged with the trunk yelling "Stop!" as he sped towards the bottom of the stairs and the hallway leading to the front door. Both of them reached the bottom and were greeted by both Mr. and Mrs. Weasley with accommodating smiles. Mr. Weasley took the trunk and Mrs. Weasley took Hedwig's cage and the broom off Harry. Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon looked shell-shocked. They both stood without saying a word. They merely watched all four of them with scornful looks. "Come on, boys, we have to get going now," said Mrs. Weasley politely. She turned towards the Dursleys. "We'll see you some other time, I expect." "Yes, of course, take care and thanks for the chat," was Mr. Weasley's civilized goodbye. Whatever was said between the four adults was obviously something that the Dursleys hadn't expected and had rubbed them the wrong way, though speaking with the Weasleys probably would have done that anyway. Harry opened the front door and a cold breeze rushed in from outside. It waved over Harry like a cold shower, removing aches and pains. It had the feeling of freedom, well, comparable freedom, as no doubt he'd be kept inside for the summer anyway. Safety reasons, no doubt. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley walked out of the house first. Ron followed quickly after. Harry, however, took a moment to just look at Fort Privet Drive for the last time this summer and then exited, closing the front door behind him. He stepped out and then in front of him he saw the Order of the Phoenix. Mad-Eye Moody, Tonks, Remus Lupin and Kingsley Shacklebolt greeted him. Immediately the ridiculousness of Moody's bowler hat to conceal his magic eye brought a smile to his face. This was much better than living with the Dursleys, and his summer hadn't even begun yet. "Right, let's get going. I don't trust the muggles around this place," said Moody skeptically as he continued to look around at the neighborhood around him, his right hand clutching his old battered broom. Harry smiled again. He was so glad to be out of Privet Drive and going elsewhere. A House of Memories. Chapter 2. A House of Memories. Harry stood in Grimmauld Place and watched the familiar magical emergence of number 12 pop up between number 11 and number 13. Harry watched as the house finally appeared in all its glory. He let out a small sigh as he watched Mad-Eye Moody turn his head in 8 different directions and then open the door to the house. Moody stepped into the house first and signaled for Harry to follow him as Remus, Tonks and Kingsley followed closely behind in flanking positions. The moment Harry entered the house, a flood of memories about Sirius flooded back to him. He was overwhelmed by them all, flying at him at 500 miles an hour. But this was to be expected. Grimmauld Place was always going to remind him of Sirius. It had his memories in every nook and cranny of the house. Harry walked through into the kitchen and sat himself down at the large table in the center of the musty old kitchen. He looked around at the dusty kitchen and images of the days spent here last summer with everyone cascaded into his head. Harry held his head in his hands and closed his eyes as he tried to stop the emotion and brevity of the place engulf himself. Harry slowed his breathing as he heard footsteps in the room. He didn't turn to meet the sounds, but instead just stayed as he was, locked in a sea of sadness and regret. The footsteps were of Remus Lupin. He stood watching Harry intently. "I know it must be hard, Harry," said Remus softly, his voice tinged with a sympathetic undertone. "But don't blame yourself for what happened. You didn't know it was only a dream. There was no way for you to know he was at home still." Harry removed himself from his hands and looked up at Remus and shook his head. "But I am to blame. I should have known it was a dream. It kept happening over and over. I should have known it wasn't actually happening, but I didn't. Remus, I didn't." Harry let out in one breath. He was cut short by Remus putting his right hand on Harry's shoulder and putting his finger on his lips. "Harry, don't let it get to you. We're all hurting after his death. But if anything we're to blame, we should have known Voldemort would exploit you like that," Remus calmly said, his voice having a calming and soothing effect on Harry. "Look, Harry, I know you must be finding it extremely hard to be here. We all are. And I shouldn't be telling you this, we're trying to get the authorization for you to spend the summer with the Weasleys at the Burrow. Don't get your hopes up, mind, but we think it might be best if you're in a location that doesn't remind you of Sirius." Harry looked at Remus and a tiny smile escaped onto his face. He'd not dreamt he'd be spending the summer at the Burrow, and there was a chance he might. But what about all the curses and spells the house has? "Wouldn't it be safer for me to be here?" Harry asked quickly, trying to find out as much as possible as to avoid disappointment. "Well, this house is a lot safer, but we feel that your emotional health is important also, and whilst we can protect you easier here, it'd be better for you in the long run if you stay at the Burrow," Remus said very matter-of-factly. "There is also a rumor that the whereabouts of the Order's headquarters has got out to some rather nasty individuals, and well, maybe if you were at the Burrow it'd avoid certain individuals harming you." Harry looked at Remus with a confused look. He'd thought that the house was a complete secret. How could anyone know of its whereabouts? Then it hit him. Harry then realized that it could very well have been Creature that let the cat out of the bag. He wasn't bound to the house, and with Sirius being dead, he wouldn't be sworn to his master's secrecy. "Creature!" exclaimed Harry, his voice bellowing around the kitchen as Remus stepped back and turned towards the kitchen sink. "Could very well have been Creature, but we're not certain. Sturgis Podmore could have given it away under interrogation from Death Eaters," was Remus' succinct reply. Harry was about to reply when the jovial Mrs. Weasley barreled into the kitchen. "Right, you two, out of the kitchen for the time being. I have dinner to prepare," Mrs. Weasley said to the two of them with a big smile drawn across her face. Remus smiled at Mrs. Weasley and then turned to Harry. "Come on, Harry. We can continue this conversation later. Let's get your stuff to your room and sorted," was Remus' polite words as he directed Harry out of the kitchen and to the foot of the stairs. Harry began walking up the stairs but was stopped by Remus, who was close enough to Harry so that he could whisper into his ear. "Harry, don't unpack all of your things. If you are allowed to stay at the Burrow, we're going to be removing you as quickly as possible. I have a sinking feeling we may need every second," Remus whispered with an air of urgency and worry in his voice. Harry didn't stop to linger, but thundered up the stairs and barreled into his room. The room was exactly as he left it. The wardrobes and paintings all had a layer of dust, and his bed lay under the placing of Phineas Nigelus' portrait. Upon the bed was his trunk and Hedwig's cage, with Hedwig stood next to it. Harry sat down on the bed and coerced Hedwig into the cage and gave her a bit of food from his pocket as he took the cage and put it in its former place of above the wardrobe. Harry turned back round and immediately tended to his trunk. He opened it up and stared for a brief moment at the multitude of things that were inside: shoes and old hand-me-down clothes and parchment, quills, etc. for school. His eye caught the image of the broken mirror for communication from Sirius, and a small tear began to make its way down his cheek. He wiped the cheek away and quickly put it into a small drawer of the trunk and pulled out some spare clothes and some pajamas to sleep in. Harry put the clothes by the bed and removed the trunk from the bed and put it on the floor and slid it underneath his bed. He stood back up properly and threw himself onto the bed and tried to relax his eyes for a few brief moments. As happy as he was to be away from the Dursleys, it wasn't without its downsides. Harry closed his eyes for a moment and tried to think of something other than Sirius farsing through the air and into the veil at the Ministry of Magic. It was an image that seemed to be permanently stuck in front of his eyes. "Harry Potter!" shouted a voice from inside the room. Harry bounced up with a startle. He'd not expected to be disturbed quite so quickly. Harry looked around the room swiftly to try and see who had said his name. Then it dawned on him. He turned to look at Phineas. Nigellus stood in his portrait with his arms on his hips and a sarcastic face greeting him. "I thought you had some sense, Mr. Potter. But obviously I was mistaken." Phineas snorted sarcastically. "What are you doing here, Phineas?" asked Harry quietly. He was still slightly startled by the way Phineas had got his attention. "Why wouldn't I be here? This is my portrait, isn't it?" he rhetorically asked Harry, his voice tinged with little to no tolerance for such questions. "If you must know, Albus sent me to check up on you," another one of his meaningless errands. "Phineas, there's more to it, isn't there?" Harry asked with a hint of wonder in his voice. "If you must know, Mr. Potter, I have to come to ask you a simple question, one I feel I need not ask, but seeing as you are his godson and that you witnessed his death, I feel compelled to ask," he said without a single hint of sarcasm, a strange mix of heartfelt sadness and curiosity. "Who killed my great-great-grandson?" Harry was confused. He'd always assumed that Professor Dumbledore would have told him by now, and that for Phineas to ask him was something he'd never expected. "But hasn't Professor Dumbledore already told you?" Harry asked him, his eyes not focusing on the painted image of Phineas. "That he has, Mr. Potter, but I do feel that to hear it from you will make it a reality," Phineas said solemnly. "Well, Phineas, it was Bellatrix Lestrange. She was the one that made Sirius fall through the veil," Harry said, his voice tinged with sorrow at having to verbally say that she had done it. Phineas didn't reply. He just stood there letting the realization sink in. He held his hand to his chin and then without as much as a word disappeared from the portrait, obviously back to his portrait in Professor Dumbledore's office. Harry was slow to turn away from the portrait and return back to lying on the bed with his head pushed into the pillow and his arms stretched out as far as he could. Harry stayed like that for a few moments. It felt good to be stretched out so far, and his bed in Privet Drive was far too small for him to even consider such a thing. Harry wiggled his fingers for a moment and wiggled his toes too as he lay there. He stopped the wiggling and turned his head towards the bed adjacent to his, and saw that it was obviously Ron's, as it wasn't made and all of Ron's things had been thrown around it, as if a Cornish pixie had been unleashed upon his clothes. "Harry, dinner's ready," shouted Mrs. Weasley from down the stairs. Harry was up quicker than he realized. He walked to the door, his stomach grumbling as if it switched on at the mere mention of food. Harry grasped the door handle to the door and turned it. But before he left for the kitchen he turned to the portrait of Phineas Nigellus and paused for a moment. "Phineas, I know you can't hear me, but I'm sorry, I'm really sorry," he said softly, his voice only just audible. As Harry turned his back on the portrait and left for the kitchen, a head popped out from the corner of the picture. Phineas watched Harry leave and didn't say anything, just stared at him for a moment with an expression of sorrow and grief. The kitchen and dining table was heaving with food. It was a Sunday evening and naturally roast dinner was on the menu. Everyone at the table was drooling in wait for the food, with knives and forks being held tightly and pointed at the ceiling. Harry stepped into the kitchen to see the table packed with people. There was Remus, Mad-Eye, Tonks, Kingsley, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, Ron and Ginny. Harry looked for a short second and found the one spare seat between Ron and Remus. He sat himself down and picked up his knife and fork as Mrs. Weasley leaned forward. "Well, Harry, I hope you haven't already eaten," Mrs. Weasley said with a chuckle. Harry just looked up and smiled. He obviously hadn't. "Well, everyone, don't let me keep you waiting, tuck in." Immediately the table was awash with hands clutching at the food as if it was gold. The roast beef went first, with Mad-Eye giving it out to everyone that requested it. Naturally no one declined. It looked succulent and absolutely delicious. Ron monopolized the roast potatoes. He stared scornfully at anyone that came within inches of them until he had at least a half dozen on his plate. Harry laughed at him as he attempted to hijack the potatoes and was greeted with a look of sheer shock and amazement from Ron. Ginny went straight for the steamed broccoli. She ignored the more popular stuff as it was pointless her trying to contend with 3 Aurors, 1 former professor, and 2 parents, an older brother and Harry. Ginny scooped 3 pieces of broccoli onto her plate and put the bowl back into the center of the table when Ron looked at her from across the table. "Broccoli, Ginny?" he chided. "That's not like you. You're normally first to the mash and gravy." "The gravy," said Mrs. Weasley suddenly. "I'd completely forgotten. Bear with me as I quickly make some." Mrs. Weasley jumped from her seat and haphazardly began making some thick beef gravy. Ron and Harry watched intently as Remus smiled at them both and began to shovel dollops and dollops of mashed potato onto his plate. "Oh, don't worry about it, Molly. I'm sure the lack of gravy isn't a problem," retorted Kingsley politely. However, the rest of the table didn't agree with him. Immediately both Mr. Weasley and Ron dropped their cutlery and began pleading with Mrs. Weasley not to stop making it. Mrs. Weasley didn't stop and after a few minutes brought the gravy over to the table. "Gravy's ready, everyone," she announced to the table. Everyone at the table, bar Harry, Ron and Mr. Weasley, had already begun eating their food. Ron and Mr. Weasley had waited for the gravy and Harry had joined in as he didn't want to miss out on the tradition of pouring gravy on his food first and then eating. "I nearly had a heart attack there, Molly. I can't have a traditional roast without my gravy," Mr. Weasley said as he wiped his head of sweat. Mrs. Weasley smiled and passed him the gravy as Ron waited with bated breath, so he could engulf his food in gravy goodness. "Arthur, I don't understand your love for this gravy. It's just thick meat juices," uttered Kingsley with a very matter-of-fact-like tone. Mr. Weasley finished pouring his gravy, passed it to Ron, and then turned back to Kingsley. "It's a Muggle tradition that I find to make my dinners taste like a dream. Apparently, they have dried gravy in shops. Harry can confirm this. Can't you, Harry?" Mr. Weasley asked Harry very suddenly, who looked over at Kingsley and Mr. Weasley as Ron passed him the gravy. Yes, it's very popular in the Muggle world," Harry said quickly, trying to finish the discussion so he could pour his gravy and enjoy his food. Harry began to pour his gravy when he was interrupted by Remus. "Harry, could you pass me the gravy when you're finished? I think I might try it," muttered Remus at Harry, as the gravy cascaded over the piles of food on Harry's plate. Harry did as Remus asked and passed him the now half-empty jug of gravy. Remus looked at the gravy for a moment and then conservatively poured it onto his roast dinner. The table was silent except for the clashing of cutlery and the sound of eating and enjoyment. No one spoke as the food quickly disappeared, the feast-like setup being gone in a matter of minutes. As soon as the final piece of food was eaten, Mrs. Weasley immediately stood up and began clearing the table and starting the washing up. "I'm stuffed. I couldn't eat another bite," exclaimed Ron with a huge grin plastered across his face. "You'll have to make room, Ron. There's dessert still," retorted Mrs. Weasley with a mischievous glee in her voice. Ron looked at his mother. His grin became even bigger as he started massaging his belly. "What are you doing, Rob?" questioned Harry. "I'm making more room for dessert. Can't let it go to waste now, can I?" replied Ron as he continued to massage his belly. "Right you are, Ron, good thinking," Mr. Weasley joked, he too now massaging his belly with bliss. Harry laughed at the silliness of both Ron and Mr. Weasley acting like a pair of 5-year-olds at the prospect of dessert. "Mom, can you hurry up? Ron and Dad are acting like a right pair of plonkers," Ginny snorted, as he looked at both Ron and her father disapprovingly. Mrs. Weasley turned and just chuckled as the plates began to be cleaned by the charmed scrubbing brush and Mrs. Weasley pulled out a giant-sized Black Forest gatto, 8 bowls and 8 spoons, and directed them to the table by her wand. She followed the gatto, bowls and spoons to the table and sat herself back too. "Oh, will you two grow up? You know rubbing your belly doesn't help anyway." Both Ron and Mr. Weasley stopped and everyone tucked into the gorgeous-looking gatto. A long queue formed as Mrs. Weasley began sharing out the gatto to all those with bowls, which was everyone. Ron was first to be served. He was followed swiftly by Remus, who'd seemed to get behind him without anyone noticing. Tonks was next up. Though she wasn't quite as stealthy as Remus, she jumped in with a gallant shout of "I'm next. This is simply delicious." Remus said as he finished off his spoonful, "You've really gone all out, Molly." "Well, it's a special occasion. It's Harry's first night here, so I thought it best I pull out all the stops," she said while smiling at Harry with that typical motherly love-type look. Harry blushed a dark shade of red as he looked down at his own dessert and continued to eat, not wanting anyone to see how embarrassed he was. The dessert again was quickly finished off, and everyone neglected to begin any real conversations during the digestion of the dessert. The only sentences were off thanks and compliments to Mrs. Weasley and the occasional "I'm stuffed," or "I couldn't eat another bite." Harry left for his room without saying much else than a few good nights and a big thank you to Mrs. Weasley for the food. It had been a long day for him and he just wanted to roll up in his bed and sleep for days. He trudged up the stairs to his room and entered his room without as much as a sound. His body almost on autopilot as he changed quickly and rolled into bed and fell asleep. Harry awoke sharply. He could hear a lot of shouting from downstairs. He couldn't figure out what it was all about, but obviously something was going on and it wasn't good. Harry sat upright and to his right was Ron sat rubbing his eyes. He looked like death warmed up and like Harry had no idea what was going on. "What's going on, Harry? The shouting woke me up?" asked Ron as he sat worriedly. "I don't know, Ron. It woke me up too. Let's go find out," Harry said as he slowly crept out of his bed and slipped on his dressing gown and stepped towards the door. Suddenly the door flew open and stood in the doorway was an exasperated Remus. He launched into the room and immediately looked at the boys. "Get your things, boys. You have to leave now," he yelled as Harry stepped towards him, looking to ask him what was going on. "What's going on, Professor?" Harry asked as he approached Remus. "We've no time for questions, boys. Pack your things and go to the kitchen. You have to leave," he replied, his voice tinged with urgency and panic. Ron looked at Harry and both boys began sorting their things out. Remus helped by taking Hedwig's cage and picking up anything that Ron may have left around the room and throwing it into Ron's trunk. After a minute or two both boys had packed their trunks and pulled them to the doorway as Remus looked at both of them. "When you get to the kitchen, do not ask any questions, just do as Mrs. Weasley says and don't go anywhere else. It is imperative that you go to the kitchen and only the kitchen. I'll be escorting you." Remus led the way down the stairs and both boys followed closely, not pausing for any reason or saying a word. They knew something was wrong and it wasn't something trivial. All three of them entered the kitchen to see Mr. Weasley stood by the fireplace clutching a bag of flu powder. He looked flustered and his face had a couple of welts and bruises as he stood. "Right, you two hurry up and brings your things here, you're going to the burrow. Take a handful of powder each and be quick," Mr. Weasley said in a ramble, the voices seemingly merging into one. Both boys took a handful of flu powder and stood close to the fireplace. "Ron, you first, you're going to the burrow," Mr. Weasley said as he directed Ron into the fireplace. Ron pulled his trunk into the fireplace and stood ready to go as a crash and a bang sounded from elsewhere in the house. Both boys jumped at the fright as Remus looked out the doorway with worry and quickly dropped Hedwig's cage off with Harry. "Ron, don't waste any time, go now," exclaimed a now panicking Mr. Weasley. "The burrow," shouted Ron as he threw the flu powder into the flames. Green flames engulfed him and in a flash he was gone. Harry wasted no time in waiting for Mr. Weasley to tell him to enter the fireplace. He pulled his trunk and Hedwig's cage into the fire and stood in the fireplace and looked out. As he readied himself to go he saw in front of him a tall cloaked thing stood outside the kitchen doorway. The figure lifted his arm and pointed a wand at Harry. "The burrow," Harry shouted and threw down the flu powder in the flames. In a split second he heard the wizard shout Avada. And then the flames engulfed him and he was gone. A deep sigh of relief. Chapter 3. A deep sigh of relief. Harry awoke in the center of the Weasley kitchen. His things were by his side as above him was Mrs. Weasley dabbing his head with a damp cloth. Harry turned his head slightly to see Ron and Mr. Weasley watching him carefully. He tried to sit up but was held down by Mrs. Weasley. "Now Harry dear, don't get up, you've had a nasty fall," she said as she continued to dab his head. What happened?" he asked as he tried to remember himself. The images of that cloaked wizard directing his wand at him stuck in his head, but after that it was blank. "You slipped as you flood into our fireplace and banged your head on the table as you fell," she softly said to Harry. "You've been out for an hour or so. Where's everyone else? Where's Remus? Did he make it back?" he frantically asked, his mind with thoughts of how it was too late and how the cloaked wizard had slain all those remaining. Mrs. Weasley took a hold of Harry's hand. "Now don't you worry, dear. They made it back just fine. They're out patrolling at the moment." Harry let out a deep sigh of relief and then slowly pushed himself into a seated position. Mrs. Weasley tried to keep him on his back, but he shrugged her off. He wasn't going to be kept down by a simple bump on the noggin. He rolled over onto his side and gingerly got to his feet as Mrs. Weasley continued to tend to him as if he was one of her sons. Well, he was considered one. Harry shook of the after effects and made his way towards Ron and Mr. Weasley. "You are a clumsy one, aren't you, Harry?" asked Mr. Weasley jokingly, his voice seemingly too jovial for what had previously transpired. "We'll have that bandaged up in no time. You'll never know you had a great big lump." Harry let out a small smile as he tried to hide his embarrassment. Ron didn't waste any time in walking over to him and punching him on the arm in the typical teenage sign of respect. "A bump won't stop you, will it, Harry? You would have got whoever it was that came after us, wouldn't you?" Ron said with a big cheesy smile etched across his face. Harry just nodded in agreement. The upbeat attitude seemed out of place, as if they'd been told to act as if it never actually happened. "You'll love where you're staying, Harry. It's great. Mum sorted out the room and everything. It took her 2 swipes with the wand and it was sorted," Ron exclaimed with a childish glee and enthusiasm. Harry again nodded. He was still trying to figure out exactly who it was that had tried the killing curse on him and how they got into the house. It was a complete mystery to Harry. He had no logical explanation, and nothing came to mind. "Right, Ron, you better help Harry sort his things out. He'll need help after that ghastly fall," she said to Ron as if it was an order and she was a drill sergeant. "Yes, sir," replied Ron sarcastically. Mrs. Weasley immediately reacted with a look as if Ron had just shot her with a BB gun. Mr. Weasley, however, looked as if he'd explode with laughter, but somehow managed to stay quiet as Mrs. Weasley turned to face him. He turned to the boys and waved them off. Both Ron and Harry picked up Harry's things and began the slow, arduous walk up the stairs with what seemed like they had 5 tons in tow. "What happened, Harry?" whispered Ron, his voice now lost of the glee and enthusiasm from earlier but one of concern and curiosity. "The moment Dad came through, he told us to act as if it was a nothing, as if it never happened." Harry was quiet for a moment as he tried to pick the right words to say to Ron. Somehow he knew that whatever he said wouldn't quench Ron's thirst for knowledge. "I don't know, Ron. All I remember was seeing that wizard and what?" butted in Ron, his eyes trained in on Harry with hawk-like precision. "I woke up. I don't remember falling and banging my head. I don't remember anything else." "Really?" Harry said disappointedly. He too wanted to know the answers, and yet it was all a blur. The boys dragged the stuff up the final few steps and into Ron's room, which now had 2 beds set out, an extra set of drawers and another wardrobe in the corner. Ron dropped Harry's trunk on the bed and flopped onto his own. His fall had the grace of an Olympic diver, but his landing had that of a stock car crash. Harry put Hedwig's empty cage next to the trunk and sat himself down without quite the fervor or Ron. "Ron, how did everyone look when they transported back?" asked Harry, his want for information, any information overwhelming any urge to fall back to sleep and continue the slumber he was in the midst of when it all happened. "Well, they looked kind of okay. I mean, everyone had bruises or cuts and things, but they looked fine," Ron said coldly, his voice slowing down as he ran the images of everyone jumping from out of the fireplace. Moody looked really angry. He was fuming. You could see his ears blowing out steam almost. "No surprises there, then. How did Professor Lupin look?" Harry moved his head slightly forward as he awaited Ron's response. He knew that Remus was fine, but somehow he just wanted Ron to say it, so it put his mind to rest. "Well, I didn't catch him really. He jumped out of the fire, tended to you for a moment and was off. He didn't say anything to anyone or anything," said Ron as he rolled over on his bed and turned to see a chocolate frog sat by his bed. "Wait a minute. I don't remember putting a chocolate frog by my bed?" Ron picked up the frog, waited for a second and then began ruthlessly unwrapping it, his lips wetting at the prospect of the creamy chocolate. Harry watched him and let out a tiny smile. For a split second Ron was a picture, his eyes deep in concentration and his fingers tearing away at the wrapper like it was Christmas Day. "Ron, I'm going to go back to sleep," uttered Harry monotonously. Ron acknowledged it for a moment before continuing his assault on the chocolate frog. Harry was quick to clear his bed of his things. He put Hedwig's cage on top of the extra drawers and slid the trunk onto the floor and left it there. Harry turned back to his bed and lowered his head onto the soft, comfortable pillow and closed his eyes. It didn't take long for Harry to fall asleep. In fact, it was almost instantaneous. It was mid-afternoon when Harry finally woke up. He'd slept right through breakfast and lunch. No one thought to wake him up as they all felt unanimously that he needed the sleep and that after the feast the day before, he wouldn't be that hungry anyway. Harry rubbed his eyes as he sat up. He had never changed out of his pajamas when he transported to the burrow in the early hours, and so was still wearing them when he woke. He wiped his eyes fully of the gunk that resided in them every time someone woke up and stretched his arms. "Good sleep?" came a voice from the bed adjacent. Harry turned with a startle to see Remus sat on the bed looking slightly worse for wear but otherwise okay. Yes," was Harry's groggy reply. He was never a good person to talk to when he woke up. He couldn't think straight nor speak straight most days. "Well, you haven't missed much. We skipped breakfast today and lunch was a downbeat affair." Mad-Eye was making his feelings known about what happened, Remus said assuredly. "What did happen yesterday, Remus?" Harry instinctively asked. He'd been itching to know since he'd awoken from his fall, and hadn't been able to speak to anyone about it other than Ron. "Who was that wizard who tried to curse me?" Remus paused for a second before responding. He was picking his words very carefully, and somehow Harry wasn't going to find out everything. "You were very lucky, Harry. If you had thrown the flu powder down a moment later, you might not be sat with us." Remus took another moment of pause. He wanted to make sure he didn't slip up in what he said. "We have no clue as to who the wizard is. Before we could apprehend him, he had operated out." "So he was only after me?" Harry asked quickly. "Yes, it seems so." Arthur and Mad-Eye had tried to battle with him, but he'd managed to hold them off with stunning spells. "He obviously had no one to kill anyone but you, Harry," Remus said with a sad tinge to his voice. Harry didn't seem too upset about the revelation. He'd grown used to being singled out, especially after Dumbledore had told him about the prophecy. "But how did he enter the house? Hasn't it got every single protection curse known to wizards?" We don't know much about how he found the house and how he entered, but don't worry yourself about such things. You're safe here for the time being," Remus said as he approached Harry and put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Now, Harry, get changed, and when you get downstairs we'll have something for you to eat and we'll talk about this again some other time." Harry walked into the kitchen to find a large cheese sandwich in the middle of the table. He strolled over and picked up the plate and felt his tummy grumble as he gazed at the gorgeous-looking sandwich. He took a large bite and walked into the lounge to see Mr. and Mrs. Weasley sat on one sofa. Ron sat reading a chocolate frog card in one armchair, and Ginny sat in the other writing into what looks like a pink diary. Harry smirked at Ginny as he walked over and sat on the seat next to Ron. He'd remembered the damage a diary could do from the incident in the Chamber of Secrets years ago, and was astonished that Ginny had the courage to write in another. Ron looked at Harry for a moment and then turned back to his card, which was of the serial goblin killer Yardley Platt. Ron was engrossed in the card, his eyes gazing at the picture of Yardley Platt looking around and then holding up one of his goblin trophies. "Harry, I was wondering, I've picked up this muggle invention and I haven't a clue what it is and what it does. Could you help me figure it out?" said Mr. Weasley amicably from across the room. "You sure? Where is it?" replied Harry, his interest piqued at the prospect of showing Mr. Weasley a thing or two about what muggle things do and what they're capable of doing. "Be careful, Harry, you never know what could happen. It might blow up in your face. Dad's been tampering with it," Ron joked, his eyes finally away from the chocolate frog card. "This way, Harry," said Mr. Weasley as he directed Harry into the hallway and down some steps into a basement den-type room. The room was simply jam-packed full of muggle things. The walls had posters, pictures, notes, and whatnot. The center of the room had 2 old armchairs and a multitude of things from wastepaper bins to frisbees to a set of weights. Mr. Weasley walked over to the corner and pulled a dusty old television over and put it down between the 2 armchairs. "Right, Harry. Take a seat and help me figure this one out." Harry smiled as he knew that he'd have no problems whatsoever in helping Mr. Weasley with this one. Harry sat himself down and took the same position as Mr. Weasley, with his head leaning towards the TV and his hands in a sort of contemplative position under his chin. "So Harry, what is it?" asked Mr. Weasley with a childish exuberance and enthusiasm permeating through his voice. Harry leaned back into his seat and purposely acted as if he was in deep thought about it. "Well, Mr. Weasley, it's he said, trying to put on his best university professor-type voice. Yes, Mr. Weasley replied anxiously. "It's a television," Harry said without a single deviation in tone or volume. "Right, that's great," Mr. Weasley exclaimed excitedly. "So what does it do exactly?" "Well, it shows moving pictures. You switch it on and you can watch movies and TV programs," said Harry. Mr. Weasley just stared at him as if he'd been speaking gobbledygook. "Right, okay, good, brilliant, so how do we switch it on?" Harry chuckled and then looked at the plug behind the TV and saw the makeshift power supply on the wall. Obviously, in Mr. Weasley's love for all things Muggle, he tried to make a power supply so that he could see a lot of the artifacts in action. "Does the power supply work, Mr. Weasley?" asked Harry. "Oh yes, we enchanted it so that it works just like it would in a Muggle household." Mr. Weasley retorted, his excitement building further as he began fidgeting with his fingers. Harry picked up the plug and pushed it into the power supply and stepped back suddenly as to avoid any explosions of electric shocks catching him. After a moment he stopped blocking his face and walked over to the TV and closed his eyes, and he pushed on the dusty power button. Officers quickly descended on Privet Drive late last night as the channels changed over, as Mr. Weasley unwittingly changed it to Channel 3, and instead of the news was greeted with some random program about builders. Harry stepped back suddenly. He just realized that it was Privet Drive that the BBC newscaster had mentioned. Was it the same thing that had happened at 12 Grimmauld Place? Was it a wizard or wizards that were trying to find him and kill him? It made him feel queasy inside. He'd never realized they would try to attack Privet Drive, and he didn't know it even was them. It could be anything. Brilliant thing, this television. Should have found out about it earlier. The boys will love this, Mr. Weasley muttered, his voice not being directed at anyone really but just as a general statement. Harry sat himself back down in the armchair and closed his eyes. Mr. Weasley turned to face him and slapped his hand on his knee. "Cheer up, Harry. I'm sure it's nothing. Probably just a bunglery or something." Harry smiled weakly at Mr. Weasley and regained his vertical base once more. "I think I'm going to go see Ron, Mr. Weasley, that is, if you don't need anything else?" he asked. No, I'm fine. Thank you very much, Harry. Your help was very valuable indeed," replied a distracted Mr. Weasley as he turned back to the television and began flicking channels, his eyes opening in wide-eyed amazement as channels which comprised entirely of white noise. Harry made his way slowly towards the lounge again, his legs dragging themselves along as he went up a short flight of steps and turned back into the lounge. "Oh, Harry dear, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," exclaimed Mrs. Weasley as she peered at Harry from above her knitting equipment, which she must have got whilst Harry was in the den with Mr. Weasley. "I'm fine, Mrs. Weasley," Harry replied gingerly. "Don't be silly, Harry. You sit yourself down and I'll sort you out a nice hot cup of tea. That'll make you as right as rain," said Mrs. Weasley as Harry sat himself down and didn't try to talk her out of it. He saw no point. She would not accept anything but a yes anyway. Mrs. Weasley barreled her way into the kitchen as Ron put his chocolate frog card down and stared over at Harry. "It got you, didn't it? It must have blown up or something. They're always doing that. It's a right death trap down there," laughed Ron. "Yeah," was Harry's rather unenthusiastic reply. "Don't worry. Mum's cups of tea always do the trick. You'll be buzzing around like a Quidditch player in no time," was Ron's comforting counter. Mrs. Weasley was back in a flash with a huge mug of tea, which seemed almost as big as Harry. She brought it over and slowly gave it to Harry. "Careful now, dear. It's very hot," she warned Harry. Harry nodded and slowly lowered it onto the arm of the chair and held it tightly with his left hand. He blew softly on the tea, a traditional method of cooling it down enough so that he could gently sip the tea. Harry blew for about a minute or two and then took a small sip. He licked his lips after the sip and quickly took another, the tea acting as a refreshing way of calming Harry down and stopping the thoughts about what happened at Privet Drive last night. "Brilliant stuff is Mum's tea. It works every time," announced Ron like he was recommending it in an advertisement. "Yeah, I feel a lot better. Thanks a lot, Mrs. Weasley," said Harry. "Think nothing of it, dear. I'm always happy to get you a cup of tea, or a sandwich or anything," she beamed. Harry grinned at Mrs. Weasley and continued sipping his tea. Every drop made his cheeks regain its former vibrant color. Harry's mood lightened also as he began to giggle to Ron's sudden outbreak of humming. "What are you humming, Ron?" he asked, his grin reaching from ear to ear. Ron stopped with a startle. "I wasn't humming, was I?" Harry let out a huge roar of laughter as Ron went from a nice pale skin color to bright red. The mug almost went flying as Harry continued to laugh, only managed to stop it when he suddenly realized he had this gorgeous cup of tea in the grasp of his left hand. "You nearly made me spill my tea," he said in a mockingly angry voice. Ron then burst out with laughter too, his eyes streaming with tears as his stomach-wrenching laugh filled the room. Mrs. Weasley tried to act mature about it all, but she too was laughing. Albeit not vocally, but her expression said it all. Diagon Alley beckons. Chapter 4. Diagon Alley beckons. The summer weeks passed by at a furious pace for Harry. Each day was a relative cauldron of relaxation, happiness and bliss compared to what he'd normally suffer cooped up in Privet Drive. He spent time playing chess with Ron, enlightening Mr. Weasley about the Muggle inventions he knew of, and enjoyed every single meal that Mrs. Weasley made. For Harry, this was how his summers should be. He only hoped that Hogwarts would come around quickly. As much as he loved being around the Weasleys, his heart was in Hogwarts, and so that was where he wanted to be. Ron thundered into the bedroom, his ginger hair aflash as he made from the bedroom door and leapt onto Harry's bed with Harry in it. Harry woke immediately, his eyes opening on the moment of impact, his head turning to figure out what on earth would be on top of him. "Wakey, wakey, rise and shine," shouted a very excitable Ron Weasley. Harry looked at him for the briefest moment as he still tried to figure out why Ron was on top and why he'd woken him up, when it was clearly still dark out. Though obviously Harry couldn't be entirely sure, it could just be that the room was dark and the curtains were closed. "Do you know what day it is, Harry?" asked Ron as he bounced about like a young puppy. No, Ron, what day is it?" said Harry groggily as he still tried to transition from being asleep to being awake. "It's your birthday," Ron shouted as loud as he could. The whole room seemed to shake as his voice bellowed and echoed. A grin escaped onto Harry's face as the realization of the day had dawned. The summer had flown by so fast that he'd forgotten that it was his birthday. In past years, he'd used his birthday as a way of motivating himself to continue on in that household. It was a glimmer of hope, a ray of light for Harry. "I'd completely forgotten," said Harry with a touch of sarcasm within his voice. Ron jumped off Harry's bed and sat down on his own as Harry sat up and rubbed his eyes. "The great thing is, we're all gonna Diagon Alley today," Ron said as he sat staring at Harry with a giddy Christmas morning kind of smile. "We are? But isn't that dangerous, with the whole thing at Grimmauld Place and everything?" questioned Harry, his enthusiasm being rather subdued as the memory of the prophecy and Sirius vying for space in his head. "No, Mum says that we'll be fine. She says that Diagon Alley will be fine as long as we stay together, and even Mad-Eye Moody agrees," Ron replied quickly, his excitement unwavering. "We're leaving in 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Exclaimed Harry, "but why so early?" "It's not early, Harry. It's nearly noon. You slept like a log," Ron said as he stared out of the bedroom door and at the stairs, his anxiousness starting to shine through. "Oh, right. Well, let me get changed and I'll be right down," Harry said quietly, his mind rushing away to thoughts of what could await him in Diagon Alley and what would happen if he was ambushed whilst out there. As much as Harry wanted to go to Diagon Alley, he didn't understand why they'd allow it to happen, when it was quite clear he was a marked wizard and he hadn't even told anyone about the prophecy yet. Harry didn't waste much time in getting changed. He was in no particular mood to be taking his time or holding the others up on what was obviously something everyone wanted. Some time in a new location would do everyone a bit of good, and maybe it wasn't so bad. After all, who could know they'd be at Diagon Alley? It was also a very public place, and so there'd be no worries or any attack being done without any witnesses. Harry walked into the kitchen to see everyone lined up, looking all smartly dressed and ready to go. Ron looked particularly excited, his grin stretching from ear to ear and his hands fidgeting as he waited as patiently as he could. "Morning, Harry, or should I say good afternoon," Remus said heartily, a sly smile itching onto his face. Harry bowed his head in embarrassment and walked to the front to the group. "Right, Ginny, you're first," Mrs. Weasley said firmly, as Ginny walked to the front of the group and took a handful of flue powder from her mother and stepped into the fireplace. "Diagon Alley," she uttered and threw the handful of flue powder into the flames, and in a big green flash was gone. "Harry, I'll be keeping very close to you today, so don't go running off," Mad-Eye said sharply, his magic eye glaring at Harry from underneath the ridiculous-looking bowler hat as Ron disappeared in a green flash. "Leave off him, Moody. The poor boy looks as if he's off to a trial," laughed Tonks as she flicked some bright blue hair from out of her eyes. "We're only going to Diagon Alley. What's the worst that can happen?" "Not a word, Moody. We don't want to scare Harry now, do we?" interjected Remus as Moody looked as if he was about to read Harry his rights. Harry let out a sigh as he waited in line still, Mr. Weasley had gone with Ron and Ginny, and Tonks was next. Tonks stepped into the fireplace with her handful of Floo powder as Mad Eye approached Harry and dropped his head towards Harry's. "Harry, like I said, no running off, you're very important, and I mean very," Moody said quietly but firmly so only Harry could hear. Harry nodded as Tonks was gone in a flash. "Right, your turn, Harry," Mrs. Weasley announced as Harry stepped forward and took a handful of Floo powder from the bag and stepped into the fireplace. He stared out at Kingsley, Remus, Moody, and Mrs. Weasley. "Diagon Alley," he said clearly, and immediately threw down the Floo powder. In a flash he was gone from the burrow. Harry emerged from the fire in the leaky cauldron unscathed. Unlike his first ever incident using Floo powder, he hadn't ended up on Knockturn Alley and had arrived with the others. He looked around the room, and other than the rugged-looking bartender there was no one but those of whom he'd come with. Everyone bar Ron was stood by the fireplace waiting. Ron was jumping about entrance to Diagon Alley as if he'd never been to Diagon Alley. "What on earth has got into you?" stated Mrs. Weasley as she appeared from out of the fireplace, her motherly instincts locking on to Ron the moment she appeared. Ron just shrugged his shoulders and continued to bounce around. "Oh, come and wait with everyone else, Ron. We don't want to lose you." Ron grudgingly walked back over and joined the crowd as Remus entered the room from the fireplace as Moody followed him soon after. Everyone stopped motionless and quiet for a moment as Moody stopped dead in the center of the room and then turned to the group, almost as if he was the nasty drill sergeant and they were his troops. Moody's magic eye looked up and down the group from underneath the atrociously picked bowler hat for concealment, and then stopped on Harry. Harry felt obviously uncomfortable under the gaze of Moody and his magic eye. He knew that all these precautions of staying as a group were merely about him, and that if he wasn't here, Ron would be out gallivanting and doing whatever it is he is so anxious to do. "Right, if you want to go into any shop, you need full clearance first," Moody hollered as he started to walk up and down the line that had amassed. "This isn't about stifling your day out, it's about safety, and safety is what's most important." Ron quietly giggled and whispered into Harry's ear, "Safety matters. We're not having any fun today," and asked for clearance. Harry giggled in response as Moody continued to walk up and down the line, but his eye was focused squarely on Harry and Harry alone, its magical qualities slicing through Harry like a scythe. "Remus and I will be leading, Kingsley and Tonks will be flanking, so none of you will be able to sneak off without our knowledge, and Harry, we mean you most of all," Moody uttered monotonously at the group. Harry tried to hide himself from view on the words, as he felt the unrelenting thoughts that his being here was putting a dampener on the whole affair. "Right, everyone. Let's go," Moody said without a single change in tone or volume. Without question everyone began moving, with Remus and Moody going right to the head of the pack and Tonks and Kingsley taking the rear. Remus made sure Harry was close to him as they walked quickly towards the little dead end around the back of the leaky cauldron. Moody stopped the convoy and tapped the specific brick for the wall to unveil itself as the archway to Diagon Alley. After a moment of reshuffling, the archway to Diagon Alley was finally open and the group entered. Diagon Alley was bustling with witches and wizards and all sorts of unique individuals. It was awash with cloaks and pointed hats scuttling from shop to shop, stopping and having brief conversations. It was how Diagon Alley always was. Moody led the group into the alley and turned to face them. He didn't say a word, but instead seemed to invite someone to offer a place to go. "Well, Harry, it's your birthday. Where do you want to go?" Mrs. Weasley asked with a smile as he stepped from out of the group and next to Moody. Harry looked around, and then gazed at Ron, who was trying to say something in some obscure sign language. "I wouldn't mind going to Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor. That'd be a good start," Harry said with a weak smile as Remus put his hand on Harry's shoulder and smiled with him. "Right, Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor it is then," exclaimed Remus with a hearty jovial feeling to his words. The group walked merrily around Diagon Alley towards Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, the mumblings and mutterings amongst the group being of what flavors of ice cream they'd buy and how good a choice Harry had made. As they came around to the front of the ice cream parlor, Harry was immediately greeted by the sudden emergence of Florian Fortescue. He'd obviously seen him coming around the corner and had rushed out to meet him. "Harry, my dear boy, it's good to see you. How did you do with that medieval report you were writing?" he asked as he patted Harry on the shoulders in a fatherly-like gesture. Harry smiled. "It was fine," he said whilst trying to remember exactly how he'd done with his report. "That's good. I'm glad my knowledge of medieval witch burnings helped." he said contentedly as he looked over the group and smiled nicely to everyone there. Anyway, it's nice to see you, Harry. As a treat, you can all have free Sundays. Immediately Ron let out a loud brilliant, as Florian turned to him and grinned, his generosity not being lost on the others either. Oh, you don't have to, said Mrs. Weasley, trying not to burden Florian with 8 eager wizards and witches all wanting one of her delicious sundaes. Think nothing of it, replied Florian, his short tired hair straining in the air as a weak breeze overwhelmed him. It's no problem at all. Like I said, my treat. Everyone stepped into the airy ice cream parlor and waited at the counter as Florian walked around the side and took her place in front of them, with his hand on the ice cream scoop and the first sundae glass. So who wants the first one? He asked with enthusiasm as Ginny stepped forward. Ginny looked at the selection for a second and then looked up. I'll have a banana and strawberry whip sundae, please, Ginny said as her mouth salivated. Florian nodded and quickly scooped it up and together and passed Ginny the sundae with the traditional long spoon. Florian smiled at Ron as he jumped to the front after Ginny and frantically began to look over the selection. What to have? What to have? He said to himself as his eyes scanned the almost endless varieties on show. Have whichever you'd like. I've seen people have 8 flavors before, he said with a chuckle as Ron's eyes opened with wide-eyed glee. I'll have that, ooh, and that, wait, add some of that, oh, and a bit of this, oh, I've got to have that mint-looking stuff and that orange-looking flavor, Ron said with excitement as he pointed at a dozen different flavors as Florian followed his lead and put them all into a single big sundae. Ron took the huge sundae from Florian and followed Ginny to a seat in the corner of the small parlor. Both of them wasted no time in getting stuck in as the others began ordering. At the back of the queue stood Harry and Remus. They were several feet away from the counter and Remus had turned to face Harry. Harry, I never realized you knew Florian. He ran this ice cream parlor when I was your age and we never got free sundaes back then, he said with a smirk. I did my homework at the table outside, during the summer the year you joined Hogwarts as defense against the dark arts teacher, he replied with a glint in his eye. Good lad, replied Remus as he stepped up for his sundae. Harry watched Remus getting his sundae and smiled an ignorant sort of smile as if this would be the only time this year or maybe for the next 2 years where he'd be able to feel the bliss of ignorance. It took a lot for Harry to forget about what he'd been through the last few years, but seeing everyone laughing, joking and eating free sundaes certainly did that. Remus walked away from the counter with his sundae and sat with Tonks and Kingsley as Harry walked forward and looked up at Florian. So Harry, what will it be?
Strawberry surprise?
Mellow.
Mint?
He said with a grin. Harry shook his head. No, choconut as always, Mr. Fortescue, Harry responded. Harry, call me Florian, he said as he smiled in reply and waited for his sundae. Florian didn't take long in rustling up Harry's choconut sundae, and it seemed to be larger than everyone else's. Harry said thanks and walked over to the table of which Ron and Ginny were sat at. Ron had almost finished his sundae when he looked up and sat in shock as the size of Harry's sundae. Bloody hell! He exclaimed as he stared at the sundae and compared it to his, which paled in comparison. He must have emptied out the shop to fill yours, Harry, you're well lucky. Harry just sat there with a cheesy grin and began to munch his way through his ice cream mountain. It didn't seem to take him long to finish it off, and surprisingly he didn't feel at all full from eating it. Mind you, Harry had skipped breakfast due to his waking up so late. Gorgeous things are ice cream sundaes, announced Mr. Weasley as he sat clutching his stomach and trying to hide the unmistakable grin which was accompanying him. We should come here more often. You do come here more often, Arthur. You seem to spend a fortune in this place. Every lunchtime whilst you're working you're in here, said Mrs. Weasley mischievously. How do you know? Mr. Weasley asked sharply, a look of confusion consuming him. Florian told me as he was serving, said Mrs. Weasley with the smallest of winks as she turned to Florian, who was busy cleaning the counter and smiling as exuberantly as always. Mr. Weasley flashed a scowl in jest at Florian as he looked up every so often. After spending almost an hour at Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, the group began to shop Diagon Alley the proper way, at a fast and frantic pace, though of course within reason, with the group never splitting up or the arrangements set by Mad-Eye Moody never changing. They went from Gamble and Japes to Flourish and Blots to Magical Menagerie and back to Flourish and Blots. They didn't seem to spend long in each shop, and if they did, Harry or anyone didn't seem to buy much. But it never got boring. Everyone was having a good time, joking, talking, and generally being nice to each other. It was a birthday that Harry felt he deserved and he of course wanted. After 2 or 3 hours spent shopping or browsing or whatever you'd like to call it, they finally stopped outside a shop of particular notoriety. Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes. Ron couldn't stop grinning as he nudged Harry in the arm consistently for what seemed like an age before Harry turned to the adults. "Well, can we?" he asked quickly, his enthusiasm for seeing what great things the Weasley twins had recently created overwhelming him. The adults converged together for a brief moment, the mumblings of the 5 of them as they mull over the prospect of the 3 children entering the joke shop. Occasionally one would look over, almost mocking the 3 of them as if they wouldn't let them go in. After a minute or two, the adults all left the huddle and turned to face them. "Yes, you can go into Fred and George's shop," stated Remus as he let slip a wry grin. "Yes," shouted Ron with unabashed happiness, his right clenched firmly into a fist and it thrown into the air in celebration. His day obviously being made with the chance to see his brother's great jokes and joke shop. Harry patted him on the back and smiled. He was maybe not as enthusiastic as Ron, but he was happy too. Ginny wasn't as enthusiastic, but she was still walking around with a small smile and her eyes glinting. The 3 of them left behind the adults and waltzed into the joke shop, their eyes immediately being drawn to the rows and rows of skiving snack boxes, Weasley's Wildfire Whizbangs, portable swamps, and a multitude of other strange-looking jokes. The shop wasn't exactly big. It looked to only have room for the rows of jokes, the counter, and enough space for 4 to 5 people to be served. The threesome stopped in the center of the room and stared at the empty counter. Harry looked at Ron and then back at the counter as they wondered where the gruesome twosome could possibly be. Ginny, though, just walked forward and gazed at the counter. "You two are so slow. There's a bell on the counter. I'll just ring it," she said. Ron put his arm out to stop Ginny but instead retracted it and waited patiently. Harry didn't know why Ron looked as if he was going to explode at any moment, but he watched anyway. It must be good if Ron knew about it. As soon as Ginny picked up the bell and rang it, the bell sprayed her with a strange red-colored liquid. Ginny dropped the bell and struggled to wipe the red liquid out of her face. "If I catch those 2, you'll do what?" said George as he apparat from out of nowhere. "I'd be careful what you say, Ginny," uttered Fred as he too apparat out of nowhere. "Brilliant," said Ron as his eyes lit up at the genius of his twin brothers. "Yeah. Nice one, you two," retorted Harry as Fred and George bowed in recognition of their genius. "Why, thank you," replied Fred in his best impression of a Muggle magician. "That's one of our newest items," proclaimed George proudly. "Spits out colored paint at anyone that hasn't cast the right spell," Fred said as he ended George's sentence. "Which is?" Harry asked. "Spat, spot, spit. All those gits," the twins said in chorus. A malevolent grin etched into both faces. "Wicked," uttered Ron without thinking. He was simply in awe of these two. "Fred, George, where are all your customers?" "I'd expect this place to be packed," said Harry as he looked around the store, his mind trying to figure out why it could possibly be empty. "Muggle order," both Fred and George said. "Don't you mean mail order?" Harry replied instantaneously. "No, Muggle order," responded George. "It's our new way of getting the jokes to the people. It's like mail order," followed Fred. "Only it's done the proper way," uttered George. "With owls," said Fred. "But why call it Muggle order then?" asked Harry, his questions making him seem completely stupid in the presence of the twins. "Well, Dad kept talking about what the Muggles do," replied George. "So we decided we'd call it Muggle order to take the mickey," said Fred as he finished George's sentence yet again. "Brilliant, so does that mean we can order from Hogwarts and get them sent to us?" Ron asked as he walked around and continued to gaze at the rows of jokes and other things. "Naturally, that's what it's for," they both said in reply to Ron, the sly grins almost permanently implanted onto their faces. "Well, I won't be ordering from you," chided Ginny as she finally managed to remove the red paint from her face, though not with a wand but done the Muggle way, with her top. "Oh yeah, we should have warned you. That paint cannot be removed by any spells. It's wizard-proof," said Fred smugly. "That'll be fun at Hogwarts then," scolded Ginny as she leered at her older brothers. "Oh, Harry, we nearly forget. Here's your birthday present," said George as he pulled out a large box from under the counter. If you hadn't come we would have sent it to you by Muggle order, said Fred as he lingered on the reference to Muggle order. Harry let out a guffaw. Thanks, he said as he took the box from George. Have a good one, Harry, the twins said in unison as Harry held the large box in his hands and let out a beaming smile. The door to the shop opened slight as Kingsley peered in. Come on you three, it's time to get going, he said as all three turned and said goodbye to the twins. Don't forget to use Muggle order. We'll keep you well stocked up with all your joke shop needs, proclaimed George as the three left the shop. Ginny made her way back to the group first, her huffing and puffing causing Remus and Tonks to look over and chuckle as her reddened top caught their attention. Ron and Harry lingered a little longer as they stood in awe of the large box and of course letting the meeting with the twins play over in their heads. Both boys finally reached the group and Ron immediately looked to see where his parents were. Where are Mum and Dad? Here we are, Mrs. Weasley's familiar voice bellowed as she walked along with a pile of bags and boxes and in her arms and Mr. Weasley looking particularly chuffed with himself. They reached the group and immediately Mr. Weasley ruffled up Ron's hair. Oh Dad, not when Harry's about, Ron pleaded. Oh right you are Ron, replied Mr. Weasley with a smile. Harry just shook his head in jest at the whole situation as Moody and Remus led the way back towards the leaky cauldron. The group passed Elop's Owl Emporium, when Moody stopped in his tracks. He turned his head which way as his magic eye whirled around in its socket like it was crazed and possessed. He signaled everyone to drop to the floor, as he continued to gaze around, unsure of what it could be. It didn't help that the crowds around Diagon Alley were a distraction and a pretty big one at that. The place was bustling with people and they cared not for what the group were doing. Crack! The crowd screamed as a loud burst of light landed near to the group, sending a couple of random wizards sprawling. Get Harry out of here, shouted Moody at Remus as he immediately charged in the direction of the shot. Remus wasted no time in bringing Harry in under his cloak and quickly escorting him to the leaky cauldron. Bang! Remus went flying as the shot hit him full on the chest. Harry looked in stunned disbelief as Remus landed hard but fortunately wasn't seriously hurt. Harry, get out of here, now! He shouted as the ensuing chaos caused Remus and the rest of the group to be lost in the crowds of scared and panicking wizards and witches. Harry tried to see who it was that was throwing curses this way, but he couldn't see anything from the crowd when suddenly he saw in the corner of his eye a green light rushing his way. Harry leapt out of the way and onto the floor to avoid the shot. The shot hit a wall behind him and large burst of flames seemed to erupt from the impact. Harry was quick to get back to his feet and using a pair of scared wizards, he quickly made his way towards the leaky cauldron. He ran through the archway and back into the pub as he heard the bricks closing up behind him. He ran into the main bar of the pub and looked around for help. Yet all there was in the bar was a mysterious cloaked wizard sat at the bar with a large glass of fire whiskey in his right hand. Harry looked at him warily. He was a foreboding presence. His dark, unkempt hair ran down from inside of the cloak, onto his shoulders, and he could see the glint of his eyes as he stared at him. Harry Potter, I've been expecting you, he said in a low, gravely voice. Please do not be afraid. I will not harm you. Harry stared at him still. He didn't know whether to trust him or not. He'd not missed being hurt by several curses, and seeing a mysterious stranger sat at a bar didn't exactly seem inviting to him. Trust me. I will not harm. I can promise you, he said again, his gravely voice showing no signs of menace or want to hurt Harry. Please sit, he said whilst signaling to Harry to take the stood next to him. Harry considered it for a moment. He couldn't go back and he would be prey for attacks anywhere else in London and he'd never come to harm in the leaky cauldron before. With that in his mind, Harry seated himself on the stool opposite. Though not without precaution he made sure he had his wand pointed at the mystery wizard at all times. Thank you, Harry, the stranger said softly. By all means point the wand. As long as you feel safe, then that is what matters. Harry nodded. Who are you? He asked immediately, his mind wanting to know so badly, so he could put to rest the worries of him luring him into a trap. You will know in good time, Harry, but for now just consider me a friend, he replied quietly, his voice never changing in its pitch or volume. You've been thinking about the prophecy, haven't you, Harry? The stranger asked. Harry's eyes opened in shock. But how did you know about the prophecy? Harry gingerly asked, his mind asking question after question about how he could possibly know. Do not worry yourself, Harry. I am a man who knows things, that is all you need to know, he retorted. But what's important is that you know something else, he said as he leaned forward, his large eyes peering into Harry's. It is imperative that you realize that, whilst the prophecy was thought to be referring to two people originally, it was in fact only referring to you. Harry knew who else he meant Neville Longbottom. But what he didn't understand was how this stranger could know it was purely meant for him. It was only ever meant to refer to you, Harry, you and only you. You may think that maybe it was wrong and that maybe Neville Longbottom is in fact the one chosen by the prophecy. Harry had envisioned that being the case, but he'd never really had anything substantial to think it was Neville and not him. For Harry it was always him, and that maybe it could have been Neville. The reason I'm telling you this is because, if he ever finds out, terrible things will happen, very terrible things. The stranger said, his voice becoming slow, and pronounced the unquestionable importance of his words being emphasized with his long drawn-out breaths. Did you ever wonder why it has always been you and only you that has vanquished evil after evil, and that you and only you has been the sole focal point of the Slytherin house's hate? Yes, replied Harry solemnly. Harry, my dear boy, you're the... Before the stranger could finish his sentence, the shouting of Kingsley Shacklebolt could be heard from the back of the pub, from where the entrance to Diagon Alley is. Harry turned to see what was going on, and as soon as he turned back, the stranger was gone. Harry looked around confused, disappointed, rudely interrupted. As much as he felt Kingsley's presence was important, he felt what was about to be said was even more important. Harry, quick, take the flu powder and go now, exclaimed Kingsley as he rushed into the room, his face bruised and welted, his left leg limping. No questions, just go, I'll be right behind you. Harry felt no want to neither question nor take his time. He took a handful of flu powder and quickly made his way to the fire. The burrow, he said clearly and threw the powder down. Flash. Reliving the Diagon Alley Incident. Chapter 5, Reliving the Diagon Alley Incident. Harry stepped into the kitchen at the burrow and immediately turned back towards the fire. He was waiting for Kingsley and hopefully everyone that had gone to Diagon Alley with him before it all happened. It was a few moments before Kingsley emerged from a flash in the fireplace. He stepped out looking distressed and worried, but ultimately angry. Angry at himself for what had happened. What happened? Asked Harry as he looked at Kingsley with sympathetic eyes. He knew that Kingsley was hurting himself inside about the whole incident, but he also knew it was nobody's fault. Are you okay, Harry? Responded Kingsley, seemingly ignoring Harry's prior question. Yeah, I'm fine, why wouldn't I be? Retorted Harry rhetorically, his mind wondering why Kingsley would ask such a thing when he was clearly in worse shape. But what happened? Kingsley sat himself down for a moment before turning towards Harry and looking at him through his experienced eyes. I don't know, Harry. There was a bang and then everyone went wild, said Kingsley as his mind retraced the steps to what happened and tried hard to figure it all out. I never saw who fired at you or how many there were. I was caught up with getting the Weasleys out of harm's way and then trying to find you. Kingsley paused for a brief second as he lowered his head. I found you and that was it. I should be back out there, but someone needs to be here with you, to make sure you don't try and go back, said Kingsley as Harry gazed at him, wondering why it all happened and how they knew he was there. Now, Harry, sit yourself down, we'll wait here together for the rest. Harry sat himself down and rested his arms on the dining table. He rested his head on his arms as Kingsley walked over to the battered kettle and filled it with water. Harry didn't turn to watch Kingsley start making 2 cups of tea. He just had images and questions running through his head like a stampede. Kingsley placed a steaming hot cup of tea in front of Harry. But Harry didn't budge or look up. He was sat worrying about his best friend Ron, Ginny, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, and most of all Remus. He'd seen Remus get hit by that stunning spell and was hoping that he was still out there fighting valiantly. Look, they'll be fine, Harry. I'm sure of it, said Kingsley assuredly. Don't hit yourself up about it all. We knew the risks of going to Diagon Alley. If we didn't, then we wouldn't be in the order doing as we do. Just wait, they'll be back in no time at all. Harry wrapped his right hand around the hot mug and pulled it close towards his lips. As much as he wanted to believe Kingsley that everything would be all right, he could sense that Kingsley didn't even believe his own words. He looked up at Kingsley, who was pacing up and down in front of the fireplace, his left hand holding a cup of tea as he continued pacing. Harry dropped his eyes to the tea and took a small sip. It was nice tea, but nothing compared to what Mrs. Weasley would make. A tear accumulated at his eye as thoughts of the Weasleys getting caught within the crossfire escaped into Harry's mind. The waiting seemed to last an age, the hours seemed like days, the minutes seemed like hours, and the seconds seemed like minutes. It was agonizing for Harry to wait so long. As each second passed, the worry about the others increased. Harry's eyes were straining to stay open when suddenly Kingsley, who hadn't stopped pacing for the entire time, jumped back as the fireplace flashed and Ginny leapt out from within. Harry immediately jumped from his seat and barreled over to Ginny, who stood covered in dirt but was smiling. "Oh, you're safe," exclaimed Harry as he reached Ginny. "How is everyone else?" Ginny hesitated for a moment before replying. "They're fine, they're just coming," she said as she lowered her head, a tear drawing from her eye. Harry didn't spot the tear as Kingsley was stood by the fireplace waiting patiently for others. He'd no reason to speak to Ginny just yet, and he knew that if Ginny came through, the others wouldn't be far behind. The fireplace flashed again as Ron walked through into the kitchen. He was holding Harry's large present from the twins and looked rather excitable. "Harry!" he immediately shouted as his eyes locked on to him. "I managed to save it, it nearly got trampled on," said Ron as he pushed the present towards Harry. Harry took it off him and put it down on the dining table behind him. "What happened, Ron?" asked Harry. "I didn't see much. I was pushed out of there before I could figure anything out." Ron stepped forward. "I didn't see much either. Mum made sure we were out of the way immediately after the first shot. It was all very exciting," said Ron with a beaming smile. Harry looked away and sighed. He'd figured that at least Ron would know. How hard could it be for someone to see something? "Dad managed to save your presents too. He gave them to Ginny whilst we were hiding," said Ron as he looked over at Ginny, looking for the pile of presents. "Where are they, Ginny?" Ginny shrugged her shoulders. "I gave them back to Mum when we came back by flu. I couldn't hold them and throw the powder down at the same time," she retorted as she then turned around and motioned towards the stairs. "I'm going to my room. I have, some things to do." Both Ron and Harry nodded as Ginny scooted from out of the kitchen and up the stairs towards her bedroom. Kingsley turned towards the two boys and walked past them and sat himself down at the dining table, his eyes focused on the fireplace as he waited patiently for the adults to return. "Ron, are you sure you didn't see anything?" asked Harry as he walked towards the dining table and sat down once again. "I'm positive I only saw a flash and then we were dragged away from the action and hidden from view," said Ron as he looked around the kitchen. Harry nodded in response. Whilst Ron may not know something, he was sure that Ginny may have seen something, anything maybe. "What about Ginny?" said Harry as he looked at Ron with that look of "she knows something." Ron stood quiet for a moment as he went over the event in his head, trying to remember what Ginny was doing during it all. "Well, I didn't see her for much of it all. She seemed to get dragged back after I did. But I don't remember much, Harry. It happened so fast," said Ron as he let out an exasperated breath. Harry didn't say anything. He just sunk into his seat as he realized that maybe, just maybe, everyone wasn't fine and Ginny had seen something she shouldn't have. Suddenly the room was illuminated with a strong green light as Mrs. Weasley emerged from the fireplace. She was carrying Harry's presents and looked flustered. She dropped them onto the table and immediately went straight to Harry and gave him a suffocating tight hug that seemed to last an age. "Oh, Harry, I'm so glad to see that you're okay," she said with a beaming smile as Harry just blushed in embarrassment. Mrs. Weasley stepped back and looked at Ron as he stood looking at Harry and shaking his head. "Now both of you take Harry's presents and go upstairs. I have to wait for the others and then we have to talk to Kingsley." Ron stopped in his tracks and turned towards his mother. "Can't we stay and listen?" he asked, just hoping that she might remotely say yes. "No, this is adult business. Now both of you, upstairs," she said firmly as Kingsley moved from his seat and walked towards Mrs. Weasley. Harry and Ron picked up the pile of presents on the table and grudgingly left for upstairs, as Kingsley quickly shut the kitchen door behind them. "What do you think they want to talk about?" Ron asked Harry as they slowly walked up the rickety flight of stairs to their room at the very top of the burrow. "What happened at Diagon Alley?" Harry responded instantly, the obviousness of his answer hitting Ron immediately. "Oh yeah," he said whilst slapping himself in the head with his one free arm. "So why aren't we allowed to listen?" Probably because it's important order business that we're too young to listen on, said Harry sharply, his wannabe in that meeting shining through. Both boys entered their bedroom and dumped the presents on the floor in front of the beds. Harry sat himself down and then slowly lowered himself down so that he was lying with his face aimed at the ceiling. Ron followed suit on his bed, and both boys lay staring at the ceiling like a pair of hospitalized friends, contemplating life's mysteries. "What do you reckon Fred and George got you?" asked Ron as he lay staring at the intricate cobwebs on the ceiling. "It's probably just a selection of their old jokes which they tormented old Umbridge with," replied Harry as he put his hands behind his head. "Yeah, they've probably put in some catalog of jokes as well, so you can buy their whole stock," said Ron as Harry laughed in response. "They'd probably have a Muggle order form in there all signed with everything in the shop on there," Harry joked. Ron let out a big cheesy grin as both boys just quietly stared at the ceiling still. "Harry," said Ron. "Yes," replied Harry. "You don't think that someone got seriously hurt, do you?" said Ron solemnly as Harry sat up slightly and turned towards him. "I don't know. No one said anything about it," said Harry as Ron rose to meet him. "Because when we were on our way back to the leaky cauldron I couldn't see Remus or Moody anywhere," said Ron. Harry's eyes opened in wide-eyed shock. "You don't think they're either seriously hurt or even worse, do you?" said Harry as a tinge of panic overwhelmed his voice. "I bloody well hope not," exclaimed Ron as Harry dropped back to his horizontal position. Harry stayed quiet for a few seconds as he contemplated whether or not Remus could be seriously hurt. It was a distinct possibility. After all, he had been hit by a stunning spell that sent him flying. Anything could have happened after Harry had entered the leaky cauldron. "Some birthday, said Ron, his voice teetering off as he lay staring still. "It was better than being in Privet Drive. I'd much rather spend my birthday with Snape in potions than with the Dursleys," said Harry sarcastically. "Can't be that bad, can it?" asked Ron, his head turned towards Harry, who was still staring at the ceiling. "It's like having Umbridge, Snape and Draco in the same lesson. It's absolutely terrible," said Harry, clearly exaggerating the extent of being at the Dursleys. "I'm not even allowed to turn Dudley into a pig, even though he already is one." Ron let out a large chuckle as Harry let slip a smile too. No, I'd turn him into an ice cream. He might try to eat himself," said Ron as he struggled to hold back the tears from laughter. Harry burst out laughing, the bellow of childish laughter filling the room and making both boys turn over in glee. "I haven't laughed this hard in ages, Ron," said Harry as he wiped away the tears of joy. Ron just smiled and rolled back into his former position. "Harry, what do you think Hermione is doing right now?" he asked. "I don't know, probably reading every book in the known galaxy for all we know," replied Harry as he too returned to his former position. "Why do you ask?" "I don't know, just curious I guess. Seems weird to not have her about, being all bossy and acting as if she knows everything," replied Ron as turned over onto his front and turned back to Harry. "Hey, yeah, I was half expecting her to be here when I got the letter from your mum, but we'll see her this summer. I'm sure of it," said Harry as he closed his eyes and tried to envision the room in his head. "Ron, have you ever tried to see things in your head? Like the room you're in and stuff like that?" asked Harry, his mind trying to paint the image of the bedroom in his head.
No.
"Why? Should I?" replied Ron, confused. "Well, no, but I have been trying it recently to help with my occlumency. I guess it might help me in some way," said Harry as he continued trying to envision the room in his head. "Oh, right, well, I'm not that good at imagining things in my head. I'm more a look-at-things person," said Ron. "Of course, Ron," muttered Harry, Ron's words not actually sinking in much and just acting as a background noise of sorts. "Harry, when are you going to open the presents? Don't you want to know what we got you?" Ron asked as he sat up and stared across as the haphazardly placed pile of wrapped-up presents, the shiny wrapping paper gleaming in the light as Harry sat up and looked over at the presents too. "I don't know. I just sort of forgot about them," replied Harry as he inched his way towards the pile, the anticipation for what could be in the presents overwhelming him. "Let's find out, Ron." Ron joined Harry on the floor in front of the pile. Both sat with their legs crossed as if they were little children sat in front of the fire as the adults sat in armchairs. Both boys sat with a childish enthusiasm, and then Harry plucked a smallish present from the pile. Ron turned to Harry. "Wait, open mine first," said Ron urgently as he pulled out a medium rectangular present from the pile. It was enclosed in a dark red wrapping paper, and had a small white bow on one side. "When did you get this present?" asked Harry. "I never saw you buy it." "Oh, well, Mum got it for me whilst we were talking with Fred and George," replied Ron, a sneaky smile hidden within his expressions. "Right, cool," said Harry as he took the present off Ron and stared at it for a moment. Harry then started ripping the wrapper to shreds. After a second of intense present opening, Harry came to see a book sat in his lap. The book was He Flew Like a Madman by Kenilworthy Wisp, Biography of Dangerous Di Llewellyn. It was undoubtedly a Quidditch book. The image on the front of Dangerous Di Llewellyn flying around like a madman made Harry smile. "Thanks a lot, Ron. I really like it," Harry said as he put the book down and gave a thumbs up to Ron. "Well, you need something decent to read this year. It's bad enough with the books we have to get for lessons, let alone what Hermione forces us to read," chuckled Ron as Harry laughed in unison with Ron. "Thanks a lot, Ron. I'll get you something special for your birthday. I promise it," said Harry. Both boys began exuberantly working their way through the large selection of presents. The debris of the fallen wrapping paper quickly filled the bedroom floor as Harry went from present to present. A multitude of different items began to accumulate next to Harry, from clothes to books, to strange artifacts to a large mug which says "I love Muggles." Harry's presents were what was to be expected but pleasant, considering that he'd get nothing if he was at the Dursleys, and that Harry also placed little weight in material things. They were cool and all, but having spent 16 years with very little, he considered friends to be much, much more important. Left in the pile of ripped paper was the final present from the Weasley twins. Harry and Ron both stared at the paper for the moment. It had images of the swap and the crazy fireworks going off. It was definitely a present from Fred and George. Harry dragged it towards him and placed his hands on the end of the box and clenched tightly with his fingertips. "Harry, can you come down here, please?" shouted Mrs. Weasley from down the stairs, her bellowing voice stopping Harry in his tracks. Harry turned towards Ron. Ron shrugged his shoulders. Harry placed the present back down and stood up. Ron stood up as well, and both boys made their way down the stairs. Mrs. Weasley stood in the doorway to the kitchen at the bottom of the stairs. She looked slightly taken aback, as if someone had told her some things she wasn't quite ready for. Harry reached her first, with Ron close behind. Both boys looked at Mrs. Weasley intently. "There you are, Harry," she said nicely, her voice as welcoming as ever. "Remus is in the kitchen. He would like to talk to you." Harry nodded, as much as verbally answering Mrs. Weasley would be the right thing to do. He also realized that she wasn't expecting it and was merely passing on the message. Harry stepped towards the kitchen door and Ron followed. "Ronald Weasley," said Mrs. Weasley sharply. "This is for Harry's ears only." Ron let out a frustrated sigh. "But he'll tell me everything anyway," said Ron quickly as he tried his best to be allowed in with Harry. Obviously, whether or not he did was another matter. As he had said, Harry would tell him later. No, Ronald, Harry, only I'm afraid," she said in response, her voice sound like a judge dealing out a sentence. "Let them both in, Molly," came Remus' voice from within the kitchen. Immediately Ron brightened and quickly followed Ron in as Mrs. Weasley stepped out of the way and made her way to the lounge. Harry and Ron entered the kitchen to see Remus sat at the other end of the dining table with a bandage wrapped around his head and his face set in a stony and contemplative expression. "Sit down, boys," he said monotonously. Both boys obliged, sitting themselves at Remus' end of the dining table. Ron stared up at Remus as Harry just looked ahead at the wall, his mind knowing exactly what was coming. He wasn't afraid of what was to come, just worried that with it would be bad news. Sure, he wanted to know what happened. He'd been wanting to know since he'd stepped back into the kitchen, but he, like everyone else, didn't want there to be bad news with it, and from the looks of Remus, there was going to be bad news. "I was only going to tell Harry this, but seeing as you'll no doubt find out anyway, Ron, you can listen too," said Remus as he sat nonchalantly. Ron smiled in response as Harry just stared off still, his thoughts confusing and uncontrollable. "I best start somewhere." "Well, where else other than when it all happened?" said Remus as he put his hand on his mouth and considered the first words of what would be the retelling of the incident. "The attack caught us all by surprise. We'd not expected it to happen in such a public place. When I got hit with that stunning spell," said Remus as his mind whisked back to the attacks and what happened after he was hit. Remus landed hard on the floor, his chest stinging from the shot. He turned up to see Harry stood like a deer lost in headlights. "Harry, get out of here. Now." shouted Remus as he struggled to regain his vertical base. Harry disappeared into the back of the leaky cauldron as Remus finally reached his feet and gingerly looked through the crowds for what could possibly be the attacker. Crack. A large explosion happened 100 yards or so back up Diagon Alley. Remus looked over and immediately began making his way in the direction. He sidestepped a stricken couple and then burrowed his way through a large crowd who were running around like a group of headless chickens. "Come on. Get out of the way, it's imperative that I get through," muttered Remus desperately at the crowd. To his left Remus heard Arthur Weasley. "Arthur, where are Ron and Ginny?" Remus said quickly, his voice trailing off, and he looked in every direction in case of another attack. "They're with Molly. She's shielding them from any harm," exasperated Arthur, his voice tinged with panic and worry. "Arthur, get them out of here, let us deal with it, your family is more important right now," said Remus as he continued on his way towards the most recent explosion. Arthur complied and quickly ran off to be with his family. The crowds were becoming increasingly harder to penetrate. It seemed with every passing second that they had become denser and even more wild, as if like fires in the forest, becoming uncontrollable and untamable as every moment passed. From out of the crowd Remus could see the strange and unique hairstyle and clothing of Tonks. He pushed through towards her, his voice trying to be heard above all the commotion and screaming. "Tonks!" he shouted, trying to catch her attention. "Tonks!" he shouted again, this she turned upon her name being shouted. She looked at him and immediately ran over, pushing past whomever was in the way. "Remus, how is Harry?" she asked immediately, the well-being of herself or Remus being unimportant at this very time. "He should be fine. I sent him through into the leaky cauldron," Remus replied, his wand held out at full length in wait for whatever could still be out there. "Kingsley left a few minutes ago to make sure you two were okay." "Well, to make sure he got out safely, more like," said Tonks as she suddenly turned and knocked Remus from out of the way. A shot had been fired from somewhere behind the crowd, and it missed Remus by a whisker. Both of them collided into the floor hard as Remus tried to fire back but instead could only see the crowds. Remus dusted himself off and rose back to his feet. This time he strafed across to a shielded position via a corner as Tonks followed. "Have you seen who is attacking us?" he asked swiftly as he surveyed the area for whatever clues or hints to anything he could find. "No, but Moody thinks there are 3 of them. He's gone out to try and take who he thinks is the leader down," retorted Tonks breathlessly. Smash. Opposite the both of them, the windows to an empty shop erupted in a burst of sparks. People leapt out of the way as the shattered glass rained down on them. Remus immediately looked to where the shot could come from and saw a dark cloak disappear from out of nowhere. "They're operating and disapparating. We have to get out of here. We're sitting ducks," said Remus as he nervously looked in every direction. "I'm not leaving Mad Eye here," yelled Tonks as Remus suddenly burst in front of her, and in a flying leap fired the Stupefy curse as a mysterious dark assailant that had just operated just in front of Flourish and Blots. The assailant was thrown back into the main window of Flourish and Blots as Remus immediately ran over stealthily. Tonks flanked him as both of them slowly approached the shattered hole for what was once the gleaming window for Flourish and Blots. In the window were the remnants of a black cloak but nothing more. The broken glass left a distinct imprint of a body but no body. "Damn it, he operated out," shouted Remus in anger as he turned back towards the street. "At least we know one thing, there is only 2 left now." "How do you know that?" asked Tonks. Remus looked at her and then pointed at the cloak. "Without that cloak, he or she has no disguise. To be seen now would be too damaging," said Remus confidently as his eyes suddenly spotted Moody coming from the top of Diagon Alley. "It's Bellatrix," yelled Moody as he came to join both Remus and Tonks. "She's here with 2 others." Moody reached Remus and dragged them into a shaded part of the street. "You 2 have to get out of here. They're not just after Harry," he said sharply, his voice menacing as his magic eye span around in its socket looking. "No searching for the Death Eaters." "What are they after?" asked Tonks instinctively. "I don't know, but the sooner you 2 are gone the better. It's not safe. Not even safe for you 2, said Moody as he pulled Remus by his jacket towards him. "I'm not losing another member of the Order again, Remus. Now go." Remus turned to Tonks and then before he could even blink was engulfed by the horrific feeling of being thrown by something else against the wall. His body seemed to shoot up and then collide with the nearby wall as if he'd been thrown from a car accident. His head immediately felt like someone had gone at it with a sledgehammer. He clutched at it with his right hand and felt the familiar warm, sticky feeling of blood accumulating at a large gash. Remus seemed to be lost within a world of blurred nightmares and pain. He stared across at Moody, who'd been thrown also, and saw the dark, sinister boots of Bellatrix Lestrange stood over Medai's unconscious body. Remus tried to stop Bellatrix, but he wasn't strong enough to do so. Bellatrix shook off the grasps at her legs and dragged Moody away from Remus and Tonks, who was also unconscious behind him. Remus tried to shout at them, but his voice box seemed to seize up on him as Moody was picked up and thrown onto the shoulders of the second Death Eater. "They captured Moody?" Harry exclaimed in shock, his voice bellowing as if he had no control on it whatsoever. "I tried to stop her, Harry. Trust me, I did. But I was too weak. That curse has knocked me for 6 and left Moody vulnerable." Remus said, a tear accumulating at his eye as he tried to tell himself that it wasn't his fault, that it was an unfortunate part of being in the Order. Ron was just lost. He couldn't look nor speak to either Remus or Harry. He seemed to be left wondering how Moody could get caught. It didn't make sense to Ron. Moody was like an Auror. Aurors never get captured, at least to Ron they don't. "Why did they take him? Why not kill all 3 of you?" asked Harry, his mind working overload at trying to figure it all out. "We don't know, Harry. The moment I returned with Tonks, we spoke to Albus about this, and he couldn't answer it either," Remus answered, his head now looking away from Harry's focus. "Professor Dumbledore was here? Why wasn't I told?" asked Harry, reeling from the knowledge that the one wizard that he trusted more than any other was here, and he didn't even know. "Harry, you'll speak to Albus in good time. He said that at some point he has to speak to you, but for now it's best you leave him to his own business. He's a busy man," said Remus, his eyes now drawn back to Harry, who had now taken a confused and rather disappointed look. "But he's not too busy to speak to everyone else," said Harry, with the anger boiling up underneath the surface. "Be patient, Harry. He will talk to you in good time. But today wasn't a good time. It's best you not worry yourself about him for now. What matters is that you are safe and nothing happens to you," said Remus assuredly. Harry nodded whilst he wanted to believe that he'll find out soon enough. It reminded him of being shut out and ignored for so long last year. For once Harry would like to find out with the rest of the adults. After all, he is the one in the prophecy. He is the one that ultimately has to face Voldemort, and he is the one that matters most. "Right, Harry. I'm sorry, but I have to end this conversation. As much as I'd like to continue on, I need some rest. I'm not quite as indestructible as I'd like to believe," said Remus jokingly as he pushed his chair back and walked towards the kitchen door. "Remember, Harry, you will find out in time. Just be patient. Hermione comes to stay." Chapter 6. Hermione comes to stay. The days following Harry's birthday flew past thick and fast. He went from day to day spending time with Ron playing wizard's chess and doing as all teenagers do. Not a lot. Both Harry and Ron had got into a routine of sorts. They'd spend their days laughing and joking around, enjoying the wizard's chess, and Ron's father wants to try out all these newfangled muggle inventions he'd unearthed. Occasionally Ron would break the self-imposed routine to lock himself up in the cluttered attic, and seemingly do nothing more than write letters to what Harry could only ascertain to be some secret girlfriend that Ron had. It was in actual fact Hermione, though Ron's want for secrecy was rather confusing, as Harry too was writing to Hermione as often as Ron was, except he did it in full view of Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, who were absolutely thrilled to have Harry doing something other than trying to get Ron with poorly thought out practical jokes. Of course Ron had initiated the practical jokes. His attempt to turn Harry into a human chicken by means of some charmed muggle glue and pillow feathers had backfired with disastrous consequences. Instead of turning Harry into a human chicken, he'd turned the kitchen into some strange themed animal room. Mr. Weasley had failed to hold back the laughter after it had happened, but Mrs. Weasley was a whole different matter altogether. Her yelling seemed to last for hours. Both Ron and Harry's ears had become dulled by the whole incident, though of course it didn't stop either of them. Harry had tried to get his own back by strategically placing a dung bomb or a dozen in Ron's bed, only for Ron to sneakily get Ginny to feel his wrath by swapping over his bed linen with hers. Needless to say, the tongue lashing from Ginny was something quite extraordinary, though of course Harry turned a deep red and Ron was laughing for days. It was a cloudy mid-August morning when Ron thundered down the rickety stairs, his red hair flowing behind him as he lumbered into the kitchen in a pair of hand-me-down black pajamas. They were his favorite pair, as they seemed to fit him adequately and they weren't electric orange either. Harry followed closely by. His pajamas weren't exposed. He had an orange and red Gryffindor-themed dressing gown on and was wearing a pair of navy blue slippers which had been bought for him on his birthday by Mrs. Weasley. "I told you I'd win. I'm unbeatable," shouted Ron as he held his arms up in a mock marathon winning pose. Harry shrugged his shoulders and walked over to the kitchen sink. "That's not fair. I was still in bed when you said go. I should win by default," said Harry as he pulled a glass from a cupboard by his head and quickly filled it with ice-cold tap water. "Sore loser," exclaimed Ron jokingly as he jumped about on the balls of his feet and enjoyed the spoils of his success. "Well, whatever that could be. Right, next time I'm gonna win by a mile," said Harry as he took a large gulp from his glass of water. "You watch." Ron just stared at him for a moment and turned to the door to the hallway and began walking towards the lounge confidently. As Ron turned into the hallway, he froze in his steps as if he'd seen or a ghost. Stood in front of him was Mrs. Weasley and Hermione. Ron stood, his jaw dropped as far as it could go and his eyes wide open in sheer shock. But you said Enna next week," stammered Ron as he continued to gaze at Hermione. "It is next week," said Hermione without the slightest hint of emotion. "Hi, Hermione," said Harry as he walked out from behind the gobsmacked Ron holding his glass of water. "Hello, Harry," said Hermione with a smile as she momentarily turned to Harry and then back to Ron. "So, where's your dressing gown, Ron?" "Harry's wearing one." Ron looked down and then suddenly, as if being controlled by a puppeteer, he tried to cover himself up. Hermione chuckled. "Oh, Ron, don't be silly. I've seen you and Harry in your pajamas loads of times." Ron removed his hands and sorted himself out. "Oh, well, I knew that. I was, playing a joke." "Yeah, that's it." Mrs. Weasley shook her head and turned to Hermione, whose wild, frizzy hair hadn't tamed at all during the previous few months. "You'll be sleeping with Ginny, dear. The two boys can help you with your things." "No, Mum," said Ron desperately. "Ginny would rip our heads off we went near her room. Not after the dung bombs." "Well, that's tough then," said Mrs. Weasley without mercy. "That'll serve you too right for using Ginny in a practical joke." Both Harry and Ron shrugged with a childish malevolence as footsteps could be heard from above them. "That'll be Ginny," muttered Ron. It was indeed Ginny. She was wearing a casual pair of blue jeans, a light yellow t-shirt, and had a sweater tied around her waist. "Hello, Hermione," she said as she came into full view. "I'll help you with your things. Those two are being right pains, acting like a pair of 2-year-olds. Ron snorted at Ginny and turned his back on her as she came into the small group and smiled at Hermione. "Hi, Ginny. It's nice to see you again," said Hermione with a pleasant sound to her voice. Both Hermione and Ginny exchanged pleasantries as Mrs. Weasley walked to the door and looked down at Hermione's things. Crookshanks was sat quietly next to Hermione's large trunk as Mrs. Weasley kneeled down and ruffled the Crookshanks' coat and then dragged the trunk towards the foot of the stairs. "Right, you two take this to Ginny's room and no monkey business," she said firmly. Ron stood straight and moved his hand to his head as if he was a soldier obeying a command from his superior officer. "Yes, sir," he shouted like a robot. Immediately Harry broke up into fits of laughter and tried to hold a straight face as Mrs. Weasley scowled at both of the boys. The morning passed swiftly as Hermione spent her time in Ginny's room unpacking her things, and the two mischievous boys spent their time strolling around the house and laughing at everything from a poor knock joke to Harry slipping and falling through the back door to the garden. It was a normal day for these two and they loved it. As the sun rose to its full height, Harry and Ron sat in the garden staring up at the sparse arrangement of clouds. The clouds of the morning had quickly left, leaving a tiny amount of them left over, which allowed Harry and Ron to tell each other what images they saw in the clouds. "That one's Victor Crumb falling from his broomstick," said Ron with a malevolent smile. "No chance. It's Snape exploding after drinking his own potion," said Harry with a chortle. "Harry, look over there," said Ron as he pointed across at a cloud just emerging from behind a large oak tree. "That looks like Draco being eaten by a huge sheep." Harry burst out in loud laughter as the cloud did indeed look like Draco being eaten by a huge sheep, or at least to the two of them it did. From behind them they heard the sound of feet trampling through the lush grass. Harry looked over to see Hermione walking over, her frizzy hair swaying slightly in the breeze as she was positively beaming. "Oh, there you two are," she said exuberantly. "I've been wondering where you are." Come to tell her off for what happened to Ginny. Have you? Proclaimed Ron with grin as she got nearer. No, but I should have. That was really mean, you too, she said without a single bit of sternness in her voice. Hey, what did I do? Ron put them in her bed. Not me, said Harry as he sat up and looked over at Hermione, as if he was about to face the Spanish Inquisition. Oh, Harry, don't be silly. I'm not going to sentence you to death, she said reassuringly. No, it'll a lot worse than that. She'll coddle you to death, Ron whispered in Harry's ear. Harry held back the laughs, but tears began to stream down his face as he struggled to try and keep a straight face. Anyway, said Hermione, I only came out to talk to you two about what's been happening recently. Said Harry solemnly, knowing full well that Hermione was aware of Moody's kidnapping and that maybe she was also going to want to know how he was feeling, which of course would garner the usual I'm fine. But Hermione was far too persistent to be stopped by anything other than Harry pouring out every feeling he has, which was definitely never going to happen. Well, Harry, it's important we know what's going on so we can figure out why they kidnapped poor Mad Eye, and what they might do next, said Hermione as if she was talking about studying for the OWLs. Oh, Hermione, what's there to know? They're trying to pick off the order so they can get to Harry, said Ron coldly, his words scaring Hermione slightly. But we don't know that. I heard what Remus had said, and it looks like they could have taken anyone that day, said Hermione. Except Harry. He was gone before they knew anything. Isn't that right, Harry? Stated Ron, his voice resembling that of an army captain more than the naive and jovial voice of Normal. Yeah, said Harry, lost within his own thoughts of what had happened that day. As much as he'd tried to put everything in the back of his mind and that he also had the memory of Sirius haunting himself, he knew there was something not at all right about it all. Well, of course nothing was right. They had attacked Harry first and then kidnapped Moody, and somehow Harry knew it was a diversionary tactic in going for him, but why? What did they want with Moody? But I just don't understand why they would take Moody? Asked Hermione rhetorically. He's not even the biggest threat. You don't think that they are going to interrogate Moody? Said Ron coldly. Do you? You don't think? She said slowly as her hands covered her mouth as the realization of Ron's word began to sink in. Don't think what? Said Harry, his mind lost elsewhere. That they'll find out how to get to YYU through Moody, stammered Hermione, her voice straining slightly as the words seemed to stay in the air for an eternity until both Harry and Ron realized what she'd said. But they can't. Moody wouldn't let them, said Ron dismissively, his mind having not yet fully considered Hermione's theory yet. Ron, there are ways to make people talk like Veritaserum, said Hermione very matter-of-factly. Oh, said Ron. Harry bowed his head and stared at the grass swaying in the wind. They'd already found 12 Grimmauld Place, attacked him in Diagon Alley, and now had Moody. What else could be next? Where would he be safe? Was Hogwarts his only place of haven? All these questions weighed on Harry's mind heavily. Sirius had died at the end of the last school year, and that was hard enough as it is, but with the prophecy and everything else that had happened, Harry was questioning whether he would even survive the torment and anguish. Oh, Harry, said Hermione as she looked at Harry's sheepish expression. I'm sorry. I forgot how hard it must be for you right now, what with Sirius going and the attacks. Harry shrugged his shoulders as if to imply that he was fine and that he would be all right. Though Hermione knew him too well to know that whilst he was brave and courageous, he was also stubborn and would rarely, if ever, open up and speak to someone. Don't worry about it, Harry. We'll be here with you if anything happens, said Ron assuredly, his polite smile morphing into a nice big grin, which was directed right at Harry. I'm not worried, said Harry with a false smile. He was struggling with the notion to tell both of them about the prophecy, but it didn't feel right. Whilst both of them looked alarmed at what had happened, they weren't necessarily troubled by it all. It was too early, and Harry didn't like to ruin his friends' nice summers with unwarranted worry about a prophecy. Hey, look! It's Draco and his 2 gorillas being mauled by a pack of stampeding blast-ended Skrewts, exclaimed Ron, trying to change the subject as he pointed up at a huge cloud gliding through the sky. Harry immediately cracked up with laughter as Hermione stared at Ron with a scolding look. What? Said Ron defensively, his hands held up at the side of him. Ron's in trouble, said Harry with a huge grin. Harry, said Hermione sharply, you can stop that too, you're both as bad as each other. Both boys looked at Hermione and then turned to each other. Oh, lighten up, Hermione, said Ron. Hermione just shook her head in disgust and crossed her arms and looked away from both Harry and Ron, who were now laughing uncontrollably. I can't believe you two are acting like everything's fine, utter Hermione. Look, Hermione, we're just as worried as you are, but we like to have a good laugh. It helps, said Harry as he immediately stopped laughing and turned serious yet again, though not without a little smile at the corner of his mouth. Oh, I guess you're right, said Hermione, but I still can't see how you two can dismiss it all so quickly. Ron suddenly dropped his grin and turned to Hermione and gazed for a moment. Dismiss it all? He said, puzzled. We're not dismissing anything, we're just trying to have a laugh every once in a while so that we don't explode from being all serious all the time. You don't see me exploding, replied Hermione. Hermione, you'd explode if someone told you the library was shut for 10 minutes, said Ron devilishly. Hermione blushed for a moment before hitting Ron on the arm. Ouch! What was that for? Asked Ron loudly. Nothing, said Hermione with a wry grin. All three of them sat laughing for a short while, before Harry got up and signaled to go. Hermione quickly followed and Ron stayed down for a few moments more before getting to his feet and joining the other two. The three of them walked through the swaying grass in the garden and entered the burrow through the back door. Ron was the last to enter the house as he stood by the door for the moment looking at the sky. Obviously he'd seen another comedy cloud. Center. This chapter will likely be the shortest of the story. I really wrote it to introduce Hermione back into the book and keep a nice mixture between action, humor and dialogue that may be important come later on. Also, whilst it is short, I do like the chemistry in there. It certainly makes for a nice funny chapter, one think. Anyway, chapter 7 will be up in a few days. I've yet to really figure out what I want in it yet. Great-great-uncle Archibald Weasley. Chapter 7. Great-great-great-great-uncle Archibald Weasley. Harry woke on a very cold August morning. This was the usual behavior of British weather. Hot and sticky one day, biting cold the next. Harry pulled his bed covers up to his chin and then dragged his feet to his chest so he could stay warm. The curtains that framed the room's only window were slight ajar, revealing a window peppered with raindrops, and the world around encompassed by a deathly black sky. Harry turned to face Ron, who was still lost within a deep sleep, his breath becoming misty due to the extreme cold of the room. Harry wondered how it could be so cold, when it was still the summer, and although the British weather was bad, it was not this bad. Harry closed his eyes for a moment in the hope that maybe he could fall back asleep and awaken when it was a lot warmer. It didn't help matters that Harry's covers consisted mostly of a wafer-thin brown blanket and a worn and old quilt that seemed to have more holes than actual substance. With it being the summer, the Weasleys hadn't planned on needing thick winter bed covers for the boys, and so both of them had been given the bare minimum. Neither minded, for it was still sweltering at night and Harry didn't like being hot and sticky. Harry's attempts to get back to sleep were futile. He was awake now and had no choice but to either suffer under the bed covers or to get up, get dressed and go downstairs where a fire in the lounge would be infinitely warmer. Harry decided on the latter. He swiftly leapt from his bed and dressed himself in the warmest clothes he had, which was basically a knitted jumper from Mrs. Weasley and some hand-me-downs from Dudley. Harry left the bedroom he shared with Ron and made his way down the stairs. He held his arms close to him as he walked down the stairs with a shiver, his body snapping forward every so often as the cold consumed him. After a minute or so, Harry had descended the rickety old stairs of the burrow and had reached the ground floor hallway. Harry looked down the hallway to see a strong orange light illuminating the doorway to the kitchen. He entered the kitchen to see Mrs. Weasley busying herself with breakfast, and Kingsley Shacklebolt sat in front of a steaming hot cup of cocoa and lost in thought. Harry paused for a second and then motioned to the table in the center of the room and sat himself down. "Good morning, Harry dear," said Mrs. Weasley softly as she turned to see him sat opposite Kingsley. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" Harry nodded in acceptance, and Mrs. Weasley began to make Harry a nice warming cup of hot chocolate. Harry sat quietly looking at Kingsley, who had seemed not to see Harry sit down, though he probably did, but was so deep in thought that he felt no need to react. "Morning, Kingsley," said Harry politely. Kingsley didn't react. "It's a bit cold, isn't it?" Immediately Kingsley's eyes blinked, and he turned his gaze from the table and upon Harry. "It is, isn't it?" he said rhetorically, "far too cold for an August." Mrs. Weasley walked over from the kitchen counter holding a hot cup of cocoa and placed it in front of Harry. "Mr. Shacklebolt and I were just talking about it, Harry," she said as Harry grasped the handle of the mug and sucked in the soothing aromatic fumes of the cup. Yes, it is most peculiar, said Kingsley as he looked over at the kitchen window. The rain pounding on the window with unheralded intensity. The rain is understandable, but the cold, now that makes it all seem a bit too peculiar for my liking. Harry nodded and took a sip from his cocoa as Kingsley stood up from his seat and walked over to the window. Harry, he said nonchalantly, when was the last time you witnessed weather this cold with no frost, ice or anything? I haven't, replied Harry honestly. Exactly, exclaimed Kingsley, you haven't and neither have I. The rain should be snow at least. Something is afoot. Oh Kingsley, do stop with the theories, you're almost as bad as Mad Eye, said Mrs. Weasley. We've had weather this cold without rain all the time. It's just the weather. Kingsley grudgingly accepted Mrs. Weasley's explanation and sat back down opposite Harry. However, Harry could see that Kingsley was still thinking deeply about the weather and its implications and causes. Harry knew at least that Kingsley shared the same mentality at Moody, although maybe not as excessively. Drink up, Harry. I'll be serving breakfast soon, said Mrs. Weasley as she began ringing the bell for breakfast. Breakfast was a low-key affair. Everyone sat eating quietly, and the conversations were few and far between, with the cold weather being the main topic of the morning. Opinions ranged from Voldemort hexing a Muggle weatherman to El Nino, to a theory that the Death Eaters had taken control of a weather device and were using it for their own gain. This theory was obviously voiced by Hermione. The theories weren't discussed much. There'd be the occasional few words and nods of agreement, but nothing much else. As much as this was the main topic, few wanted to talk about the cold when everyone was wearing at least 5 layers of clothing each. After breakfast, Harry began to explore the house alone. He'd explored before, but with it being so cold and Ron wanting to spend some time playing wizard's chess with Hermione, Harry was left to his own devices, which at the moment with the weather was searching every nook and cranny of the house for something interesting. This could be anything, knowing what Mr. Weasley kept in the house. Harry avoided search the basement as he'd been down there already this summer, and whilst it was a cauldron of interesting things to most wizards, to Harry it was merely a collection of broken stuff that Muggles use every day. Instead, he decided to search the variety of hallways and rooms that led from the rickety stairs. As much as the house was a mishmash of levels, it still had a large amount of rooms, and Harry had only seen the main bedrooms and nothing much else in his time spent at the Burrow. Harry turned off at the second-floor junction at the stairs and turned into the hallway that housed the twins' old bedroom and a toilet. He walked down the hallway looking at the doors and checking to see if any were unlocked, but unfortunately for Harry, they were either completely ajar, showing an empty bedroom housing a multitude of boxes, or locked, and Harry had neither the inclination to open and face the wrath of an angry Mrs. Weasley. Harry stopped at what looked to be the end of the hallway and turned to leave when he spotted some shiny concealed in the wall. He walked over for a closer inspection and saw that it was actually a doorknob half hidden in the wall and half out. He put his hand on what he could of the doorknob and pushed down. To his surprise, a door opened, revealing a dark and dingy small room. It was covered with dust and spiders' webs and was unfurnished except for a single painting on the far wall. Harry entered the room cautiously. It wasn't like the Weasleys to have a room which was left well alone unless it had good reason not to be entered. Harry looked around again and noticed that the room also had no windows. He turned back to the painting ahead of him and approached it. He looked deeply at the painting and noticed that it was an old painting of the Burrow. It wasn't the Burrow he knew today, but it was still undoubtedly the Burrow. "Who's that?" came a voice from within the picture. "What are you doing here?" Harry jumped back startled. "I'm sorry, I was just looking around." "Who are you?" said a shaggy-haired redhead wearing an old-fashioned tweed cloak and strange black riding boots. "I'm Harry Potter," replied Harry slowly, his voice straining. "So you're that Potter boy, the one my dear nephew keeps going on about," said the picture with a sly grin. "Your nephew?" said Harry, puzzled. "Yes, my nephew Arthur, sweet man, has an unhealthy obsession with plugs, methinks. But what can you do? I wasn't exactly the best role model," the picture said, smiling. "You weren't?" Harry asked. "Oh, of course not. I was always playing tricks on hapless Muggles, poor people. Never even realized I was the one who started the infamous frog downpour of 1717. Said the picture, his smile now erupting in a cheesy grin that consumed the lower half of his face. "Oh, that was you," said Harry, acting as if he knew it well. "Sure was, though I never got the credit. They gave it to that bleeding fake Robert Wackleston," said the picture, his grin now replaced with a deep snarl. "If only they knew it was I, Archibald Weasley, I might have got myself on one of those chocolate frog cards Ronald loves to collect. Oh, so you talked to the Weasleys then? Said Harry without thinking. Talk to the Weasleys? Exclaimed Archibald. I am a Weasley. Why wouldn't I talk to my family? Harry didn't answer the question. Instead, he stared around the room for a moment and then shot Archibald a confused glance. Why are you locked up in this dirty room if you talk to them? Ah, yes, well, you see, they don't like my wake-up calls, said Archibald, his face now smiling again. They couldn't have been that bad, said Harry sympathetically. Well, if using a foghorn at 4 in the morning isn't bad, then I don't know what is, said Archibald malevolently. Harry let out a chuckle as he realized just how funny it would be to see the whole Weasley house running around like headless chickens at the sound of a foghorn at 4 a.m. But they fixed that by putting me in this room. They say it's soundproof. It must be. My foghorn doesn't work anymore, said Archibald as his head drooped in disappointment. Well, it must be pretty lonely in here, uttered Harry. It is, but I have my distractions. I've managed to remove a tree from the painting completely. Took me 12 years to do it, but I succeeded. Oh yes, I succeeded, said Archibald as Harry's eyes moved to the large blank spot in the painting just left of the burrow. So you're Harry Potter? Said Archibald quickly as he spotted Harry's eyes focused on something other than him. Yes, said Harry. Well, you certainly look nothing like some Dark Lord destroying super wizard. Now do you? Said Archibald with a chuckle. Excuse me? Said Harry, slightly perturbed by the comment. He certainly never considered himself to be a Dark Lord destroying super wizard. Harry was just Harry. Lighten up, boy. I was joking, Archibald said sincerely. All these escapades have caused you to lose your sense of humor. Oh no, retorted Harry, my sense of humor is fine. Ron and I were playing pranks all summer. Really? Said Archibald, his interest immediately piqued. What exactly was one of these pranks? Well, I placed a dozen dung bombs in his bed covers, said Harry. No, said Archibald angrily. That just will not do. You youth these days have no imagination. It's only a bit of fun, protested Harry, feeling slightly offended that Archibald Weasley would be so angry over a simple prank. No, if you want to pull a proper prank, here's what you do, said Archibald, his eyes twinkling like a small child with new toys. Archibald began to show Harry a masterful prank from within his own vault of practical jokes. It seemed complicated at the least. It took almost an hour for Archibald to explain all the wand movements, steps and directions needed to pull off the king of all practical jokes, as Archibald would frequently say during the instructions. Now remember, this is for someone you particularly hate, said Archibald with a wicked grin. Someone you hate with venom. Have you anyone in mind? Oh yes, said Harry exuberantly. I know the perfect person. The door to the room suddenly opened and Mr. Weasley walked in, his eyes darting from Harry to Archibald in the portrait and back to Harry. Harry, said Mr. Weasley loudly, his voice startling Harry and causing him to turn round in shock. I see you've met my great-great-great-great-uncle Archibald. That he has my dear nephew. We're getting on just swimmingly, said Arthur as he looked down upon Harry with a look as if Harry was part of the family too. That's good to know, Archibald, said Mr. Weasley with a smile. I'm really sorry, Mr. Weasley, said Harry apologetically. I found the room by accident. Don't worry about it, Harry. We were going to introduce at some point anyway. No point in hiding our only family member portrait from you now, is there? Said Mr. Weasley as he held Harry by the shoulder with a fatherly-like gesture. Had I known how much you resembled my own young self, I would have insisted we were introduced, Harry, said Archibald as he began to walk around the painting randomly. Now, Harry, I think you best leave Archibald to enjoy his walk and come and see this, said Mr. Weasley, steering Harry away from the picture. Archibald put a hand up in a farewell gesture as Harry began to walk with Mr. Weasley. What's going on? Asked Harry. Let's just say that the weather has taken a strange turn, said Mr. Weasley as he led Harry down the stairs towards the kitchen. The kitchen was bustling with people. Every person in the house was stood in the kitchen looking out the window. Harry tried to see what it was they were looking at but couldn't see his way through the crowd. Suddenly Hermione turned and ran over to Harry. You have to see this, Harry. It's a blizzard out there, said Hermione with a childish enthusiasm. It's what? Said Harry, shocked at what he had just heard. Hermione didn't answer and instead dragged Harry over to a decent view from the window. Harry looked out the window at the white world that had seemingly appeared from nowhere in the middle of August. The snow was being ruthlessly thrown at the house and ground by severe swirling winds. The large oak tree out in the garden was now completely white, its branches swaying fiercely with the wind as the onslaught continued. It started half an hour ago, said Remus's eyes staring out at the inhospitable white wasteland. The rain just seemed to stop and the temperature dropped further. Then all hell broke loose. How can anyone survive that? Asked Ron, his question not aimed at anyone in particular. No one answered. They all seemed too hypnotized by the never-ending amount of snow being thrown from the dark skies above. No one said a word for at least 10 minutes as they all gazed in awe. This was something that happened once every 1,000 years or so. But what about the owls with the OWL results and our book lists? Cried Hermione, breaking the uneasy silence that had consumed the room. They'll be fine, said Mrs. Weasley assuredly. They managed in the winter, and they'll manage now. Hermione let out a big sigh of relief as Ron turned to face her. There's a blizzard in August, and the worst thing you can think about is your OWL results not getting here. Heaven forbid you might get them late, said Ron sarcastically. Hermione scowled at Ron as Harry let out a chuckle and Ginny giggled. Calm down, you two, said Mrs. Weasley firmly as she turned to the two children. Ron grinned and turned back to watching the blizzard as Hermione turned red and crossed her arms angrily. Harry, has your scar hurt recently? Asked Ron, whispering into Harry's ear so that only Harry could hear. No, it's been fine, replied Harry in a hushed tone, his voice only loud enough for Ron to get his answer. You don't think Voldemort had something to do with it, do you? Ron flinched at Voldemort's name as Mr. Weasley leaned over the shoulders of the two boys. Now boys, if you're going to whisper, you might as well tell us all what you're saying, he sang jokingly. We didn't say anything, said Ron with an air of deceitfulness. No, Mr. Weasley, we were only talking about the new defense against the dark arts teacher and who it could be, lied Harry. The new defense against the dark arts teacher, said Remus with a glint in his eye. I think I may have an idea on who that may be. You do? Said both Ron and Harry in unison. Oh yes, although I'm not entirely sure, it may be another Auror, one whom is well respected in the wizarding world, said Remus. He's widely believed to be the best Auror around. But Moody was the best Auror we've ever heard of, said Hermione sharply. Ah, said Remus, Moody was once the best, there is no doubt about that. But this wizard is something else, he keeps to himself, but there is no doubting his undeniable ability. It's a shame he declined Dumbledore's offer to join the Order. Who is this wizard? Asked Harry curiously. I cannot say, because if I am wrong then it'd be detrimental to his work in the dark and murky underground of the wizarding world, uttered Remus, obviously being vague so that none of the young wizards could do some research and come across whomever it may be. I will say one thing, if he does teach defense against the dark arts he'll certainly take a shine to you, Harry, that I can be sure of. Harry looked at Remus blankly. That could mean anything. Many wizards have taken a shine to him since he knew he was a wizard, and not all of the reasons were exactly for the want to do good. Kingsley, who is this wizard? Hermione asked, trying to see if she could somehow get it out of Kingsley, who obviously knew the answer also. Oh, I couldn't indulge that information, he said with a chuckle. I couldn't go behind Remus' back. Now could I? Both Harry and Ron shook their heads in jest, as Hermione turned her back on everyone and stared out at the blizzard ravaging the world around them. A loud crack of thunder exploded from within the white wall outside. Ginny and Hermione both jumped in response to the sudden burst of sound and light. Ron looked at Harry and mouthed the words "scaredy cats." Harry let out a guffaw. Oi! Yelled Ginny at Ron. I've seen you jump at a pot falling in the kitchen. No, I haven't. I'm unscarable, he stated arrogantly. Suddenly a huge bolt of lightning erupted from the clouds and lit up the white garden. The sound was deafening and the suddenness of it caused Ron, Hermione and Ginny all to jump. Ron jumped slightly whilst Hermione and Ginny jumped into each other and then backed away from the window. I think everyone should go sit in the lounge, said Mrs. Weasley in a motherly tone of voice. This blizzard is becoming even worse by the minute. She led the 4 children from the kitchen and into the warm lounge, its fireplace glowing orange from the medium-sized fire burning inside of it. Harry and Ron sat on the large sofa, whilst Ginny and Hermione sat themselves down by the fire, their backs turned on the two boys, and engaged into a quiet conversation that only the two of them could hear. I don't know why Mum has sent us here, Harry, said Ron. It's only a bit of snow and lightning. Your mum is just trying to keep us safe. We both know she overreacts, said Harry. Yeah, I know, but I'd like to watch it. It looks cool, he said, his eyes widening with glee at the prospect of a huge storm. Such is the teenage male's fascination with storms that you'd think with one so close, they'd both be sneaking off to see it at first hand. Hermione, do you think you know who is causing this? Asked Ron. Hermione turned immediately and waited a few moments for her thoughts to accumulate and a theory to finally make its way from the depth of her knowledgeable mind. Well, he has to, doesn't he? You don't get blizzards in the middle of August, ever. I guess, but how would he do it? Chimed in Harry, his reluctance to engage in the conversation not as powerful as he'd hoped, as he was really intrigued to know how someone could control the weather like this. I don't know, Harry, but if he can control the weather, then what else could he do? The possibilities of his evil are endless, she said starkly, the words staying in the air for an eternity it seemed. But why control the weather? Asked Ron, his want to know the answers as strong as Harry's. I don't know, Ron, why do you always ask me? I'm not a seer, I don't know everything, said Hermione firmly. Yeah, you got that right. I'm sure Professor Trelawney would be predicting 7 apocalypses and 15 grisly deaths for Harry, as well as why this is all happening, joked Ron. Hermione threw a pillow at Ron in response and hit him on the head as she turned back to Ginny and resumed her original conversation. Ron looked at Hermione with his mouth wide open but didn't say anything. Instead, he turned back to Harry, who had the box of wizard's chess in his hands. Come on then, Ron, challenged Harry, as both boys set up wizard's chess. The OWL results. Chapter 8. The OWL results. The astonishing snowstorm that had wowed and worried everyone had only lasted a single day, which was even more worrying than the storm itself. However, it didn't take long for everyone to put it in the back of their mind as a freak incident and to get on with things. It was several days after the storm that Harry was woken with a startle. Hermione stood holding 3 large letters in her hands and was absolutely beaming with joy. She thundered into the room as soon as they'd been delivered and had awoken both Ron and Harry with shrieks. "Ah!" groaned Ron, still half asleep. Wake up, our OWL results are here," said Hermione, smiling. "I can't wait to see how I did." Harry sat up and rubbed his eyes as he focused on the excited Hermione, her bushy hair bouncing along with her as she jumped on the balls of her feet, clearly anxious for both boys to open the letters with her. It took Harry a moment to clearly figure out where he was, and why he'd been awoken from his dreamless slumber. But once he did, he wondered what all the fuss was about. "The 7 in the morning," said Harry, glaring at his watch. "Can't you open yours and let us open it in 5 hours or something?" "Of course not, we can open them together," she said strongly, her voice imposing itself on both Ron and Harry. "Can we at least wake up first?" said Ron as he tried to shake off the cobwebs of being prematurely awoken from his slumber. "You're awake now," she said quickly, before pushing the letters addressed to Ron and Harry into their hands. "I'll go first." Hermione did not hesitate in ripping open the envelope with her right hand. She looked at the open envelope with bated breath, her lip caught between her teeth as the anticipation was obvious to all. She slowly put her fingers into the envelope and pulled out a piece of light brown parchment. She stared down at the spidery writing and stared for a second before a large smile burst onto her face. "I got 10 OWLs, she said jubilantly, her joy and happiness at her great results completely lost on both Ron and Harry, who were just staring at her in disbelief. "You got 10? said a shocked Ron. "That's more than I even took. I'll be lucky if I get 5. "We can't all be know-it-alls," said Harry jokingly, his words immediately drawing a sharp, scornful gaze from Hermione. "Lighten up, Hermione. I was only joking." "Oh, well, seeing as you made the joke, you can open yours now," said Hermione, leering at Harry. "No, I want to open mine next," said Ron, surprising both Hermione and Harry. "I don't want to wait any longer." Harry just shrugged and leaned back as Ron sat up fully and grasped the letter tightly. He closed his eyes for a brief moment and opened the letter, his head aimed squarely at the wall as he tried to keep his eyes away from the letter until the very last moment. As the letter was pulled from the envelope, Ron grimaced. "So?" asked Hermione curiously. I got 4 OWLs, he said disappointedly. "I was expecting at least 5. I'm sure I nailed the divination exam. The prediction of Harry's death never fails." Harry let out a large guffaw as Hermione stood staring nonchalantly, her arms now crossed. "Oh, do grow up," she uttered sharply. "Well done, Ron," said Harry with an encouraging tone. "You did better than Fred and George." "I did, didn't I?" he asked rhetorically, a beaming smile now on his groggy-looking face. the bags under his eyes still heavy after waking up. "Your turn, Harry," said Hermione enthusiastically. Harry looked at Hermione and then turned to his letter. It seemed heavier than Ron's or Hermione's, and yet it was the same size and thickness. "It's a bit heavy for it to just be my results," he said. "Well, open it and find out," said Hermione quickly. Harry ran his finger over the edge of the envelope and then ruthlessly opened it, the paper shredding at the top as his finger burst through the paper. He opened the letter slightly and looked inside. There were 3 bits or parchment folded up inside and something shining in the glint of the room's light. He reached inside and pulled a red and gold Quidditch captain badge from the envelope and stared in awe. "You're the new Quidditch captain," said Ron with a beaming smile. "Brilliant. That's great, Harry, you'll make a good Gryffindor captain," said Hermione. "But Umbridge put a lifetime ban on me. I can't be the captain. I'm not even allowed to play," said Harry confused. "Obviously Professor Dumbledore rescinded the ban and made you captain, or at least Professor McGonagall made you captain," said Hermione intelligently. Harry pulled the red and gold badge out fully and placed it on his bedside table. He looked back inside the envelope and pulled out the next piece of parchment and began reading its spidery writing. "Dear Harry, I hope that you are well in the burrow. We felt that it was necessary for you to be in a place of which you could be content and happy. Anyway, I'm not writing to you to ask how you are, but to explain why you have been chosen as Quidditch captain. I know that Madame Umbridge had placed a rather extreme lifetime ban on you and have thus rescinded the ban. It was a ridiculous ban and thus should have never been given. Regardless of that, I have decided that you are the worthiest person to be the new Gryffindor Quidditch captain. It is also in part because of my own mistake in not making you prefect in believing that you had enough on your plate. I hope that this makes up for last year and that you'll lead Gryffindor to glory. If of course you feel that someone else is worthier of being Gryffindor Quidditch captain, then please send me a owl saying so, and I'll be sure to consider it. Of course I do not expect you to do so. Wear the badge with pride and I'll see you at the start of term. Yours sincerely, Professor Albus Dumbledore. What's it say?" asked Ron. "Well, it's just Professor Dumbledore writing to say why he chose me at Gryffindor Quidditch captain," said Harry, his focus still on the parchment and Professor Dumbledore's words. "Well, time to face the music," said Harry, holding the folded parchment which contained his OWL results. "Here goes." Harry opened the parchment and gazed upon his results for a second before looking up at Hermione and Ron, who were both leaning towards him, waiting anxiously to see how he did. "Well," asked Hermione. "I got 6 OWLs, said Harry, surprised. "But I don't get it. I managed to get an O in potions." Ron's jaw dropped. "An O in potions?" he asked, still dumbfounded by the sheer ridiculousness of what Harry had said. "But Snape always said you were terrible, a bane upon potions, a boy who got by on his fame and fame alone." "Oh, Ron, you know Harry was a lot better than Snape said. Snape failed him because he could," said Hermione, who wasn't quite as shocked as Harry or Ron. "I can take the classes to become an Auror now," said Harry with a smile, now realizing that whilst he would have to face Snape for another 2 years, he could still become an Auror. "Yeah, it's not as if you're unqualified," said Ron with a smirk. But it was true. Harry was more than qualified to become an Auror. He'd faced Voldemort in a one-on-one duel and survived. Very few wizards, or even Aurors for that matter, could ever add that to their CV. "Hey, did you two get your books list as well?" asked Harry, pulling out the parchment with the list written on. "Yeah," said Ron. "Of course we did," said Hermione. "Hogwarts would never forget to put in the book lists now, would they?" "Well, no, I was only wondering," said Harry, looking away from the biting stares from Hermione, who looked as if Harry was considering blasphemy. "Good," said Hermione swiftly before looking at her list and then smiling. "I have 2 of these books." "No surprises there," was Ron's snide remark. Harry giggled as Hermione let out a large cough and then rolled her parchment up. "Well, I'm going to give these to Mrs. Weasley. She'll be off to pick the things up today. Want me to give her your lists?" she said to Ron and Harry as she was getting from her perched position. Both Ron and Harry nodded and gave her their book and items lists. She rolled them up and in a split second was gone. The day went relatively quietly for Harry and Ron, whilst Mrs. Weasley was out shopping for books and clothing and whatnot. Both of them engaged in wizard chess. They had around a dozen games before Harry finally gave up and conceded defeat to the far superior Ron, his logical thinking a linchpin of a good wizard's chess strategy. The games had managed to burn up most of the afternoon, their attentions being diverted from playing to eating and then just talking. It was by all accounts a typical day for them. Occasionally Hermione would come join them for 10 minutes at a time, her reasons being general discussions about life and what they'd want with Moody, what could cause the weather, and many other unanswered questions that she felt compelled to dwell over in her head. Of course Harry too had pondered it all, but he chose not to make it a public discussion as he knew more than both Ron and Hermione, and if he did really speak his mind he'd no doubt talk about the prophecy, and he isn't ready to let him closest friends. No. At least not yet. Evening descended on the Burrow as Mrs. Weasley returned from Diagon Alley. Her arms filled books, school equipment, and much more. She dropped the stuff onto the kitchen table and immediately called for Ron, Harry, Hermione, and Ginny. It didn't take long for the four of them to emerge from their rooms and appear in the kitchen. Hermione and Ginny entered first and were swiftly followed by Harry and Ron, who were still continuing their conversation about the complexities of the Quidditch positions. "There you all are," said Mrs. Weasley as the four children sat themselves at the kitchen table and gazed at the huge pile of bags and packages. "What did you get, Mum?" asked Ron energetically. "Oh, I got plenty," said Mrs. Weasley with a grin. "Everything on the lists and then some." Immediately everyone around the table beamed in anticipation at what the extra things could possibly be. "Did you get my new broom?" asked Ginny with a smile. She had been expecting a new broom since the end of the last term, and although she hadn't been promised one, Mrs. Weasley had let loose hints during the summer. "Well, you'll be pleased to know, dear, that I managed to pick up a Nimbus 500. She said, pulling the broom from out of the pile and giving it to Ginny, who looked as if her grin could get no wider. "As for everything else, well, it's not just for you children. I had to pick up a few things for Remus and Kingsley, oh, and Arthur too. He really wanted a new Muggletricity detector," she said as she sifted through the sheer mountain of goodies and siphoned off everything for the adults. Both Kingsley and Remus had been coming and going, never really staying long enough so that Harry could speak to them about the goings-on. But that was to be expected. With the impending war, Dumbledore had no doubt got them working tirelessly for the Order. On the off chance that Harry could speak to either of them, all he managed to get out of them was vague answers that didn't actually mean much. Of course Harry was sure they knew exactly why Moody had been taken and was working to get him back, though he wasn't sure when they would mount the rescue. As for Nymphadora Tonks, well, she spent a lot of time around the house, keeping a watchful eye, but she wasn't very communicative to the boys. She was more interested in talking to Hermione and Ginny, which really irked Ron. He'd found it very sexist for her to ignore the two boys because they aren't as talkative, or using Ron's exact words, "we don't gossip," though trying to imagine Hermione having a good old gossip was almost impossible. "But Mum, how could you afford it all?" asked Ron, his natural worry that it was all second-hand coming through. "Oh dear Ronald, with your older brothers all living elsewhere, your father and I have been able to save a little each week, so that we could treat you all," she politely answered. "Wicked," replied Ron instantaneously. "So what did I get?" "Well, Ronald, I got you an official Chudley Cannons jumper and one of those newfangled broom warmers," said Mrs. Weasley. "The man in the shop insisted that you'd love it." Ron didn't answer. He was simply speechless. And he never got anything new before. Well, he rarely got anything new. He leaned forward and took his pile of books, parchment, robes, and items, and took extra care with his jumper and the broom warmer. He turned to leave, but then looked at Harry and decided that whilst he wanted to spend every waking moment with his new things, he also wanted to see what Harry got. "Hermione, I got you the new edition of Hogwarts: A History and the Healer's Compendium. I hope you like it," she said with a small smile as she passed over the two books and the incredibly large pile of books and equipment that Hermione needed for school. Hermione smiled graciously and immediately took the pile in her arms, said thanks, and left for her room. Ginny followed her with her stuff, and both Harry and Ron were left staring at the rather small pile on the table compared to what everyone else had got. What did Harry get, Mum?" asked Ron, confused. "It doesn't look like he got anything." "I'm sorry, Harry dear. I wasn't able to get you anything. There just didn't seem to be anything you'd like," she said sympathetically. Harry just stared at the floor. He didn't mind not getting anything, but seeing everyone else with beaming smiles and hauling their pile of goodies, he felt left out. "It's not so bad," Harry thought to himself. "At least I'm happy, it's all that matters. But don't fret. Remus said he got you something and that you'll get it when you arrive at Hogwarts," said Mrs. Weasley, looking Harry square in the face and trying to coerce him into a semblance of a smile. He's left it with Albus. Harry let slip a smile. He was much happier knowing that Professor Dumbledore would have a gift from Remus, and he would also be able to ask questions about what's going on. Though whether or not Dumbledore would let him know any concrete was a whole different matter altogether. After last year, Harry didn't quite trust him fully. It was knowing that he'd been ignored for so long that rubbed Harry the wrong way. "Right, you two, go take your stuff upstairs and pack it all away," said Mrs. Weasley, signaling for both Harry and Ron to go upstairs. "You're leaving for Hogwarts in 2 days. You don't want to be late because you didn't pack it all in time." Harry picked up his things and joined Ron on the short journey up the stairs towards their room. Both of them were struggling to carry everything as they weren't superhuman or the male Adonis. Not they were both normal wizards who were skinny and pale, the way it should be, or at least that's how they felt. "So what do you think Remus got you?" asked Ron as he hauled his large bags up the first rickety flight of stairs. "I don't know," replied Harry, dragging his bag of books along the landing towards the second flight of stairs. "It could be anything." "Yeah, well, I bet it's something magical from like some obscure country in Eastern Europe or something," said Ron as they finally reached the bedroom. "I wish it's probably just going to be some of Sirius," said Harry. "It'd be great if it was, but I don't know, I still think about what happened and well, the memories are painful enough without having an item of his." Ron nodded in agreement as both of them hauled their items over to where the 2 trunks were standing side by side. "You'll get over it, Harry. I have faith in you," said Ron as he lowered his parchments, ink bottles and quills into a special compartment in his trunk. "Yeah, I guess, but Sirius was my only real family," said Harry, his eyes starting to well up as the replays of Sirius Fall Through the Veil played over 1,000,000 times a second. "What about the Dursleys?" replied Ron without thinking. "Oh, Ron, you know what I mean," retorted Harry as he put his new Defense Against the Dark Arts book into his trunk and then covered it up with his Hogwarts cloak. "Well, Harry, think of it like this, the happier you are, the less you're likely to notice something is seriously wrong in the world," was Ron's very surprising philosophical type statement. Harry stood for a moment pondering Ron's statement. "I guess you're right. Again," said Harry, beginning to smile again. "That's twice in the space of 2 minutes. What's going on with you today, Ron?" Ron shrugged jokingly, and both boys continued packing away in silence, only occasionally breaking it to hum or just randomly make noises. They were definitely 2 16-year-old boys with short attention spans. All aboard the Hogwarts Express. Chapter 9. All aboard the Hogwarts Express. Both Harry and Ron were up at the break of dawn. Their excitement at returning to Hogwarts was welling over and both had trouble sleeping. As much as they liked the holidays, they still loved to be at Hogwarts. It was a second home for Ron, and for Harry, well, it felt like his home. He'd never felt at home anywhere but at Hogwarts. It was a shame that this was his penultimate year there. It seemed to go by so fast. Harry sat up in his bed and wiped the gunk out of his eyes before turning towards Ron. "Not long now," he said with a smile. "Yeah, I can't wait," replied Ron, sitting at the side of his bed, his feet being lowered into a pair of scuffed slippers. "Who do you reckon will be the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher?" asked Harry. "Well, as long as it's not sniveling Snape," retorted Ron with a wry grin. Harry laughed in response and got out of his bed and put on his black dressing gown. "Ron, do you think Professor Dumbledore will hire another Auror? With the war and all?" "I don't know," replied Ron, thinking about it. "He probably would. But after what happened to Moody, I'm sure he'll be keeping constant vigilance." "Ron, that was very ironic," said Harry. Ron stared at him for a brief second. "What was ironic?" "Never mind," replied Harry, smiling, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Let's go get some breakfast," said Ron as he too put on his dressing gown, though instead of being black it was a faded gray and had several holes. "Will your mum be up at this time?" questioned Harry. "Oh yeah, she's always up early when we catch the Hogwarts Express. She thinks if she's up any later we'll all miss the train," replied Ron. When Harry and Ron entered the kitchen, it was already filled with people, all bustling about, eating, talking, and being jovial. Hermione and Ginny were sat opposite Kingsley and Tonks, who were all eating a large traditional fried breakfast. Harry sat next to Kingsley and picked up a plate from the center of the table and waited for Mrs. Weasley to serve him a lush breakfast. Ron sat next to his sister and also took a plate from the center of the table. "Morning, boys," said Mrs. Weasley as she turned from the stove with a frying pan in hand. "Are you hungry?" "Oh yes," said both boys in unison. Mrs. Weasley smiled and served them their fried breakfast, the bacon, beans, sausage and toast all set nicely onto the plates. Harry waited for a moment before tucking in, his taste buds salivating at the prospect of another gorgeous meal. "So Harry, looking forward to school?" said Kingsley. "Yes, I can't wait," replied Harry, eyeing a large piece of bacon. "Nimber con I," said Ron, his mouth packed full of beans and sausage. "Ronald Weasley, do not speak with your mouth full," said Mrs. Weasley bitingly. Ron looked down at his plate, his face red with embarrassment, as the chuckles from everyone around the table died down. He grudgingly stuck his fork into a piece of bacon and chewed on it, as he tried to keep a low profile until everyone had forgotten about his talking whilst eating incident which had happened 15 seconds ago. "So Hermione, are there any special boys in your life?" asked a very curious Tonks, who was smiling at Hermione. No, of course not, why would there be?" said Hermione defensively. "No reason," smiled Tonks. She clearly got exactly what she expected from Hermione with that answer. "Well, if there was one, you'd tell me, would you, Hermione?" said Ron, managing to speak without his mouth being full. "You're not jealous, are you, Ron?" said Ginny, looking up from her breakfast.
No, uttered Ron.
"Did you all pack you things?" asked Mrs. Weasley. "Yes, Mum," said Ginny, as the other three just nodded and continued eating. "That's good, we'll be leaving immediately after breakfast," said Mrs. Weasley as she looked down at the small silver watch around her wrist. It didn't take long for everyone to finish off their food and begin dressing for the trip to King's Cross, and for the children the lengthy journey on the Hogwarts Express. The trip to King's Cross itself was uneventful. Tonks and Kingsley acted as escorts, and having caught a taxi from the Burrow, it was an hour or so until they finally reached King's Cross and the never-ending flow of people that came with it, being one of London's biggest stations. It took the group about 5 minutes to navigate the crowds and finally reach platforms 9 and 10, the columns separating both them acting as the magical entrance to platform 9 3/4. Kingsley and Tonks stayed on the Muggle platforms to make sure no one followed through or attacked from behind. It didn't take long for Mrs. Weasley and the 4 children to go through the entrance and appear on platform 9 3/4. "Right, well, don't take long now, the train will be leaving very soon," said Mrs. Weasley to the 4 children. "Yes, Mum," said Ron, seemingly annoyed, as he'd done this 4 times before, which would have been 5 if it wasn't for Dobby the house elf. "Come here, let me see you all before you leave," said Mrs. Weasley, feeling slightly overwhelmed by seeing 4 children she loved immensely leaving for another year at school. The 4 children all walked up to Mrs. Weasley. Both Ginny and Hermione took the kiss and cuddle amicably, whilst Harry and Ron tried to shy away from it, but were unable to stop Mrs. Weasley planting a kiss and dragging them in for a cuddle that seemed more like a bear hug than anything else. "Don't forget to write, and take care, don't get into any trouble," said Mrs. Weasley quickly, as all 4 of the children climbed onto the train and waved goodbye to Mrs. Weasley. On the train, Ginny ran off to the compartment which was housing Dean Thomas and a couple of 5th-year Gryffindors. She had said goodbye to the trio remaining, and then quickly made her way out of sight. Harry stood in the corridor of the train and knew exactly what was coming. "Well, Harry, we have to go and do our prefect stuff," said Ron unenthusiastically. "We're really sorry, Harry, but we'll come sit with you when it's all done with," said Hermione, dragging Ron down the train, as Harry watched on and just shrugged. "See you in a bit then," said Harry, as both Ron and Hermione made their way up to the front of the train. Harry walked a few meters down the train and looked through the small window on the door to each compartment until he came across a compartment which seemed to have only 1 person inside. He opened the sliding door to see a rugged-looking wizard sat before him. The wizard had short dark hair with tinges of gray. His face was covered in gray stubble, and his strong eyebrows overlooked a long scar that snaked its way from his left eye to his mouth. His piercing green eyes turned to look at Harry. His typical adult attire shifted with the body as the adult wizard turned towards Harry. Do you mind if I sit in this compartment?" asked Harry with a slight ounce of unease in his voice. "By all means, please do," replied the wizard gruffly with a deep and overpowering tone of voice. Harry sat himself down slowly and looked at the adult wizard for a moment. "So are you a new professor at Hogwarts?" "A very perceptive. I am Xavier Tobias, the new defense against the dark arts teacher," said Xavier with a slight smile as he looked over at Harry. "Pleased to meet you, Professor Tobias." "I'm Harry Potter," said Professor Tobias before Harry could finish his sentence. "I'm well aware of your history, Mr. Potter," It is extremely well documented. Harry looked away, slightly embarrassed. He should have realized that unless you'd lived under a rock for the last 16 years, then you would have known full well who Harry Potter is and what he'd done. It was impossible to hide from. He even had his own chocolate frog trading card. Such was his fame. But do not be alarmed. I am not one of the Ministry minions who believe that you're a fake, said Professor Tobias assuredly. Oh, so did you work with the Ministry before you became the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher? Questioned Harry, his interest in Professor Tobias' history shining through. In a manner of speaking, I was loosely affiliated with the Ministry, but I never had the pleasure of working within the confines of the Ministry, said Professor Tobias, a twinkle appearing in his green eyes. Oh, so what was your job? Said Harry. Well, I'll not lie to you, Mr. Potter. I was an Auror, replied Professor Tobias. However, I'll leave it at that. I'm not obliged to tell you anymore. Harry knew why Professor Tobias could not tell him anymore, as it was obvious he had been hired by Professor Dumbledore because he was an Auror, and if he was to indulge further information it could jeopardize the year ahead. Though what Harry couldn't figure out was why, if Professor Tobias is an Auror, why he was so detached from the Ministry. Surely all Aurors are hired and employed by the Ministry. So, Mr. Potter, I've been wondering, which house were you sorted into? Asked Professor Tobias curiously. Which house? Said Harry, confused at why a professor would ask such a question. Of course, I too was a Hogwarts student and have been curious about which house you were sorted into, said Professor Tobias. It's also a good line of conversation. Oh right, well I'm a Gryffindor, said Harry. Ah, of course, said Professor Tobias. Professor, yes, Mr. Potter, which house were you sorted into? Asked Harry. Well, I was sorted as a Slytherin, replied Professor Tobias, his eyes watching Harry to see what his reaction is. A Slytherin? But you don't look much like a Slytherin, retorted Harry without thinking. Mr. Potter, you're not very smart now, are you? Replied Professor Tobias with a wry grin. Not all Slytherin students had pasty white complexions, and as much as you may think that we're all evil and conniving, it is not the case. Oh, but wouldn't you be sat with your Slytherin counterparts? Asked Harry again without thinking. Well, no, I was a Slytherin, yes, but only because I had a want to always be successful. I did not share their feelings about Muggle-born wizards. I am merely a wizard who does not judge people by their bloodlines, said Professor Tobias indignantly. Mr. Potter, if I was to be sorted today, no doubt I wouldn't be chosen as a Slytherin, but unfortunately, as you may be aware, I am the exception and not the rule. Harry nodded. Professor Tobias, did you know Professor Snape? He asked, clearly wanting to know whether he would be able to have an influence on Snape. I can't say that I did, though I am several years older than Severus Snape, replied Professor Tobias, his mind deep in thought as he mulled over the thoughts of Professor Snape and whatever link, if any, there may be between them. Having said that, he may indeed be familiar with me. My cousin wasn't exactly on best terms with him. Immediately the image of Sirius Black came to Harry's mind. It was quite astonishing to find that Professor Tobias was indeed related to Sirius Black. It was probably why he'd been employed as an Auror and relation to Sirius. He was probably a secret order member of which Professor Dumbledore never mentioned, as he may be spying for them. Suddenly Harry's thoughts were squashed by the sound of Ron echoing through his head. There you are, Harry, said Ron from the doorway, his eyes scanning Ron and then glancing over to Professor Tobias, who seemed to ignore both of them. Good day, Mr. Potter, I have to see some of the other professors, said Professor Tobias as he got from his seat, picked up a long black leather coat and put it on. He lowered his head in acknowledgement of both Ron and Hermione and was gone. So who was that, Harry? Asked Hermione in her usual inquisitive way. Harry waited for both Hermione and Ron to seat themselves before telling them about Professor Tobias. It didn't take long for Harry to tell them everything he knew, because as far as it went he didn't know much. Ron was naturally wary of anything involving the use of Professor Tobias being a Slytherin, and Hermione had begun to deliberate over Professor Tobias being the older cousin of Sirius Black, or whoever it is, considering Harry had made the assumption it was Sirius. But how do we know it is Sirius Black? Said Hermione almost rhetorically. But it has to be, it doesn't make sense any other way, replied Harry. Yeah, but he was a Slytherin and the rest of Sirius' family were Slytherins. It has to be Sirius, said Ron, feeling all smart. But we don't know that for sure, said Hermione. It could be anyone from Snape's year. He wasn't exactly Mr. Popular. Well, for now I think it's Sirius, and until told otherwise it'll stay that way, said Harry, trying so hard to remove Sirius' death from his mind, but this, like everything else, kept it right there at the front of his mind. However, He didn't feel so bad knowing that there was another member of Sirius' family that wasn't a Death Eater and seemed trustworthy. Although with Professor Tobias being a Slytherin he wasn't exactly thinking of him as completely trustworthy. He didn't like to admit it, but Harry was never certain of a Slytherin's motivations. "Anyway, Harry, you'll never guess what we saw?" said Ron, grinning. "Oh, Ron, he doesn't need to know," interjected Hermione. "Know what?" said Harry, obviously wanting to know now that Hermione said that he doesn't. "Pansy Parkinson was bossing Draco Malfoy about like he was her house elf," said Ron, now bursting into laughter. "What are you laughing at, Weasley?" sneered Draco, his eyes peering at the trio. "Oh, fob off, Malfoy," replied Ron venomously. "What's the matter, Weasley? Tired of living like a peasant?" retorted Draco with a grin. Ron immediately grasped his wand, but Hermione looked at him firmly. "Put it away, Ron, he's not worth it." "Oh yes, do listen to the mudblood, you wouldn't want to be hexed into next week, now would you?" said Draco, smiling at Hermione as if he was untouchable. "Just try it, Draco, you wouldn't stand a chance against the three of us," said Harry, who was concealing his wand. "Potter, how dare you speak to me like that?" snarled Draco angrily. "My father is in Azkaban thanks to you. I'm gonna get you back." "Oh, bugger off, Malfoy, you don't want to end up with your dad now, do you?" said Ron with an added confidence. Draco didn't respond. Instead he leaned forwards towards Harry and dragged his thumb across his neck in the universal sign for "I'm going to get you," and stormed off laughing. "Why does he feel the need to barge in on us?" asked Ron rhetorically. "Probably because—" "Oh, Hermione, I don't want to lecture on why Malfoy is an idiot," said Ron, interrupting Hermione, who was about to begin a lengthy dissection of Draco's motivation to constantly put the three of them down. The door to the compartment was opened again. This time, instead of the bleach-blonde Draco Malfoy, Luna Lovegood and Neville Longbottom were stood in the doorway smiling and just generally looking amicable. "Room for two more," joked Neville, looking at the space left over with there only being 3 people in the compartment. "Hey, you two," said Harry, smiling. Both Luna and Neville sat down and everyone began to utter tales of their past summer and what shenanigans they'd all got up to. "I got a new wand," said Neville exuberantly. "I got it as soon as I got home. I can't wait to use it." "So will you finally be able to do some spells properly?" asked Ron with a huge grin. Hermione punched Ron on the arm as Neville just laughed and gave a big thumbs up to Ron. "Well, herbology doesn't need a wand, so I should be fine." It was true that herbology doesn't need a wand, and Neville's strongest class was by far herbology. So fortunately, if his wand didn't help, then he'd be no worse off than the years before. "I spent the summer with my dad," said Luna, leaping into the conversation. "I helped investigate the story that a group of lactosectans had been drowning mice." "Lactosectans?" uttered Hermione sharply. "Oh yes, they're a rare breed of magical cows from the Orkney Islands. Dad says they might have been bred from cows and armadillos," replied Luna, glowing with her strange knowledge of all things utterly ridiculous. "I'm sure they are," said Hermione sarcastically. Luna ignored Hermione's sarcastic rant and pulled out an edition of the Quibbler, which had a sketch of a large cow-like creature with one single rippled horn and claws instead of hoofs plastered on the front cover. "That's a lactosectan. Dad says it's very dangerous. The artist almost got killed trying to sketch it." Hermione crossed her arms and stared out the window as the 3 boys chuckled and looked at the picture enthusiastically. "It doesn't look very mean," said Neville, looking at the picture. "It's smiling." "Yeah, dangerous creatures don't smile, they growl and snarl," said Harry. "It's not smiling, that's how a lactosectan looks," replied Luna. "Oh," said Neville before turning his gaze towards the window. It was drizzling outside, the windows peppered with tiny raindrops and the sky a light gray color. Hermione hadn't turned away from the window since her sarcastic comment, and everyone had wisely left her to it. It didn't take long for the group to find themselves under a deluge of sweets and chocolates, as the refreshments trolley had arrived not long after the mention of the lactosectan. Naturally, with Harry in a good mood, he treated everyone and bought out the trolley, which was a lot of sweets and chocolate. Obviously, the lady who served them knew he'd probably buy her out and so brought extra. Ron went straight for the chocolate frogs. Harry stuck with some plain old fudge. Neville went for some of Mrs. Delectable's delicious drops of honey, a honey-based sucking sweet. Luna had some biscuits and every flavor beans, and Hermione, well, she grudgingly accepted some plain chocolate from Harry and continued watching the outside world as she scoffed it down. It didn't take long for everyone to completely eat everything that Harry had purchased. Ron of course managed to get himself a nice large pile of new cards, though he had most of them. He tried trading them off to Neville, but Neville made the excuse that he didn't collect the cards. Ron was disappointed but figured he had the whole of Hogwarts to trade his newfound selection. Hermione, however, wasn't watching through the window in anger or disgust, but with a strange, intriguing gaze at the world passing by. "We're not taking the normal route to Hogwarts," said Hermione, still staring out the window. "Excuse me?" said Harry, turning to look out the window also. "We've taken a different route," said Hermione, her finger now pressed against the window. "You see that town over there?" "Yeah, what about it?" said Ron, also intrigued and looking out the window. "Well, we have never passed it before." She said, her eyes unrelenting in their analytical gaze of the landscape. "But Hermione, there is only one route to Hogsmeade Station," said Luna quite surprisingly. She was the last person anyone expected to dispute the strange change in route. "Well, it is possible that the route could be changed if Professor Dumbledore wanted to, keep everyone safe," said Neville, sat looking at the compartment wall then out of the now crowded window. "But we're prefects, we would have been told if they'd changed the route," piped in Ron, whose face was pressed up against the glass of the window. "Not necessarily, Ron. If Dumbledore wanted to keep it secret, he wouldn't tell anyone but the driver," responded Hermione, now turning away from the window and sitting back down. "Or maybe the driver doesn't even know," said Harry, also seating himself again. "Professor Dumbledore can make stranger things happen." "Well, whatever the reason, we're not going to find out here, now are we?" said Luna, acting very serious. "Lighten up, Luna," said Ron with a chuckle. "You look if someone has just told you the Earth is triangular." Everyone in the compartment but Luna laughed heartily at Ron's joke. Eventually Luna managed to lighten up again and was talking in detail about the Quibbler and the many items of interest from its most recent issues. These stories of interest managed to keep everyone amused until in the middle of the dreary evening the Hogwarts Express finally stopped in Hogsmeade Station. Harry leapt off the train and immediately he could see the large lumbering frame of Hagrid directing the new first years into a large group from which he'd take them to the boats and then across the lake. Harry quickly dragged his trunk and Hedwig in her cage over to Hagrid. "Hello, Hagrid," he said enthusiastically. "Oh, hello there, Harry," replied Hagrid in his gruff voice. "Did you have a good summer then?" "It was great," exclaimed Harry with a big grin. "I had a blast." "There's good tur here," replied Hagrid, leaning down towards the considerably smaller Harry. "Those Dursleys didn't treat ya bad, now did they?" "Oh no, I spent the summer with the Weasleys in the Burrow," replied Harry, still grinning from ear to ear. "Of course, I knew said Hagrid, his face red with embarrassment. "So did you have a good summer?" asked Harry, genuinely interested in what Hagrid did in the summer. "Oh, well, I can't tell ya right now," replied Hagrid, looking at the first years. All stood around and looking a bit shell-shocked. "I have to get these lot off to Hogwarts." "Okay, I'll see you later, Hagrid," said Harry as Hagrid motioned the first years to the end of the station with his arms. "Take care, Harry," said Hagrid quickly before escorting the first years out of view. "Just missed him," exclaimed Ron from behind Harry, his face covered in sweat and his trunk slung by his feet. "So how is Hagrid, Harry?" Harry turned towards Ron. "Well, he's good, a lot better than last year," he said with a smile. "Well, he should," interjected Hermione. "He would have still been in the mountains if this was last year." "You really know how to bring the mood down, don't you, Hermione?" said Ron with a frown. "Oh, Ron, I was only being honest," she said with the smallest of smiles. "Anyway, we best get to the Thestral-drawn carriages. We don't want to be late now, do we?" The three of them quickly took their things and made their way to the large collection of carriages. Most of the carriages were already full and a selection of students that started jumping into the last few completely empty ones. "Quick! Let's get the empty carriage over there," said Hermione quickly. The three of them were just quick enough to get the last completely empty carriage. They loaded their trunks and cages and whatever else they'd brought along and got in. It wasn't long until the carriages started making their way up the long grassy knoll towards the castle, towards Hogwarts for their 6th year. I hope everyone likes this chapter. I enjoyed writing it as I always liked the Hogwarts Express chapters when J.K. wrote them. Anyway, I hope it's enjoyable, as whilst I'm strict on myself, I still do enjoy my own work. Anyway, things should start to pick up again soon, with the lessons starting and a lot more else. There'll be plenty of actions, incidents, and strange occurrences. Endless arguments. Thanks to all who read and enjoyed this Chapter 10. Endless Arguments. The Great Hall of Hogwarts was coated in a warm and inviting shade of orange, its ceiling filled with floating candles all burning in unison. The 4 grand tables that represented the 4 houses of the school were filled with students. Their enthusiastic chattering and tales of their summer adventures filled the air. Harry, Hermione, and Ron sat near the front of the Gryffindor table. Beside them sat Neville and Seamus, who were lost in the regaling of their summer holidays. The staff table at the head of the room was headed by Professor Albus Dumbledore, the old and wise headmaster of Hogwarts. To his right was the empty space of which Professor McGonagall filled Professor Snape, Professor Sprout, and Rubeus Hagrid, the large and lovable care of magical creatures professor. To his left sat the new defense against the dark arts teacher Professor Tobias, Madame Hooch, Professor Flitwick, and Professor Trelawney. Professor McGonagall was missing because it was her duty to meet the new first-year students and escort them into the Great Hall for the traditional sorting ceremony. Of course, the Great Hall was ready for the ceremony. In the large space between the staff table, which sat atop its smallish perch, and the student tables was a single stool with a worn and dusty old sorting hat, its age clearly showing with its torn edges and worn fabric. "Hurry up, I'm starving," exclaimed Ron, his hand grasping at his stomach, implying that if he doesn't eat soon he'll collapse from starvation. "You were sorted once," said Hermione in response. "How would you like it if everyone wanted the food first?" "It would have been a whole lot better than sitting on that stool in front of the whole school," replied Ron. "Anyway, they're not even here yet. They're probably still being led from the main entrance by Professor McGonagall." "Oh, Ron, you really should learn to grow up," said Hermione, shaking her head as Harry just sat chuckling. "And you too, Harry, you're no better than Ron." "What did I do?" said Harry defensively. "You didn't grow up, Harry," said Ron mockingly, with his finger wagging at Harry, and a huge grin etched across Ron's face. "Oh, be quiet, both of you. Professor McGonagall is here with the first years," said Hermione, her attention now on the front of the hall. Sure enough, as Hermione had stated, Professor McGonagall had arrived with a large bunch of shell-shocked first years. Their faces white with fright, they slowly walked into the hall and stopped in front of the 4 main tables and faced the staff table. The stool and sorting hat sat directly in front of them, set in an intimidating blue light. Suddenly the motionless sorting hat sprang to life, and the rip near the brim of the hat opened wide, and the hat burst into song. When it grew grim, in days of old, where the darkest hour seemed at hand, it'd fall to the noble and bold, to the clever and smart, to the apt and cunning, to the quiet and loyal. All 4 houses were involved, all 4 houses were entwined. Slytherin, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff. Together they stood, divided they would fall. For we could take heed from their advice, it seems we face another crisis, a war which consumes us all. Our only hope is to fight together. Together we stand. Together we succeed. Divided we shall surely fall in the hearts of us all, is the key. Listen to my words, for I have seen it all, times of light, times of dark, times of hope. Stand together, Hogwarts, as it once was, and let the sorting begin. The hat fell silent as the students watched on for a moment before erupting with tumultuous applause. Rows upon rows of children stood and applauded the song from the sorting hat, its words barely having echoed throughout the great hall. After several minutes, the ovation finally died down as Professor McGonagall stood in front of everyone clutching a parchment of names. The crowd watched on with bated breath as one by one the new first years were sorted into their houses. With every student came a loud roar of approval from the house of which he or she had been sorted into. It didn't take long for every single student to be sorted, their young innocent souls being overwhelmed by the support and cheers that rained down on them. At last there remained just one more first year, a young small boy with short brown hair, a gawkish expression of wonderment and worry, and a strange pair of spectacles that seemed to stick to his brow. He looked around at the students waiting patiently for him to be sorted and for the feast to begin. "Would Richard E?" said Professor McGonagall loudly. The whole of Gryffindor seemed to buzz as his name was called out. No one knew that Oliver Wood, the former keeper and team captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, had a brother, but they all were expectantly waiting for the sorting hat to shout Gryffindor through the room, as being a Wood he couldn't be placed anywhere else. Little Richard Wood walked forward from his place and sat upon the stool nervously. His head was quickly hidden from view as Professor McGonagall lowered the sorting hat onto his head. The sorting hat moved and writhed on Richard's head. seemingly taking forever to decide upon Richard's house before finally pausing and then shouting Slytherin. The Gryffindor house groaned in sheer shock as the Slytherin house table erupted in a chorus of cheers. Richard would climbed back off the stool and almost arrogantly walked over to the Slytherin table and sat himself down as he was mobbed from all sides. "How did they get Oliver Wood's brother?" exclaimed Ron bitterly. "He should be a Gryffindor like his brother. How do we even know that he's Oliver's brother?" responded Hermione in her typical smart manner. "Wood is a very popular surname." Harry didn't involve himself in the conversation and instead hushed the two of them as Professor Dumbledore rose from his seat at the head of the staff table. Professor Dumbledore surveyed the students before him and let slip a minute smile. "Let the feast begin." In a blink of an eye, the tables filled with food, bowls of mashed potatoes, peas, chicken, carrots, roast potatoes, and a lot more appeared before the hungry students. Before you could even say what a feast, everyone was tucking into the food with unrestricted glee. "It's about time," proclaimed Ron as he shoveled potato onto his plate and then piled on loads of bacon and sausages. No one replied to Ron. Instead, Harry and Hermione began filling their plates with food, albeit not as enthusiastically as Ron, but they did still have quite large helpings of everything. The whole room was awash with sounds of cutlery and plates clashing, goblets being slammed on the table, and food generally being eaten. After about half an hour, when all the food had been ruthlessly swallowed up, the tables were magically cleared and Professor Dumbledore rose from his seat once more. "Now that you have all enjoyed the magnificent feast, I have a few notices to read out," said Professor Dumbledore with an inviting smile. "For the new students and some of the more reckless ones, the forest in the grounds is out of bounds to all students. As much as your curiosities may be overwhelming, there are creatures in the forest that would not hesitate in having you for dinner." Harry, Ron, and Hermione let out guffaws as they knew exactly what would greet any wayward students who decided to enter the forest. Of course, that didn't stop them entering. But what would? "Argus Filch, our caretaker, has reminded me that magic is not to be performed outside of classes. He also has a list of outlawed items which is inside his office." Dumbledore turned towards Argus, who was stood in the Great Hall doorway looking as miserable as ever. "We also have some good news for all those students that were unduly punished by the former headmistress, Mrs. Umbridge. All of her former laws and regulations, punishments and such have been deemed null and void." A huge smile gripped Harry. The letter he'd received from Professor Dumbledore had cheered him up, but hearing it in person was the icing on the cake. Of course, Professor Dumbledore didn't say it directly, but Harry knew exactly what he meant. "I am also very pleased to announce that we have a brand new defense against the dark arts teacher in Professor Tobias, who has taken time out of his busy schedule to be here this year," said Professor Dumbledore as he pointed over at Professor Tobias, who stood up and took the gentle applause that greeted him humbly and with the wave of his right hand. "I have no further notices to be said, so you may all now leave to your common rooms." The students all applauded Professor Dumbledore generously before the room began to empty swiftly. "Do we have to escort the midgets again this year?" said Ron, getting up from his seat. "No, not this year. That's been left to Colin Creevey and your sister Ginny," said Hermione, already stood up and motioning towards the entrance to the great staircases that led up to Gryffindor Tower. "Good, so we can just go straight to the common room then?" replied Ron, looking anxious. "Of course we can, Ron. Not unless you have some late-night shopping to do," said Harry with a smirk. Ron glared at Harry for a moment before turning and following Hermione out of the Great Hall. Hermione was walking at the head of the trio as they turned around a corner and onto the main stairs that led up to their common room. "So Harry, when will be the first Quidditch practice?" asked Ron exuberantly, his wanna get started shining through. "Oh, Ron, Harry's probably not even thought about it yet," said Hermione, interrupting Harry, who was about to respond. Hermione, of course, was right. Whilst Harry had thought about being Quidditch captain, he hadn't yet thought about practices or even filling in the empty spaces in the team. His thoughts were still dominated by serious death, but it wasn't as bad as it had been. His mind was still a dangerous minefield, with all that had happened this summer with Medai's kidnapping, the stranger he'd met in the leaky cauldron, and the knowledge of the prophecy. His mind was not exactly rosy. "Oh, well, you better get one sorted fast, Harry. Slytherin will likely have one sorted for tomorrow," said Ron, obviously hoping to be Harry's right-hand man. "Yeah, I'll give it a think later," replied Harry, clearly not paying attention. As they turned another set of stairs, The trio were greeted by a grinning Dean Thomas who was stood waiting for them. The trio slowed up as they came within a few feet of him. "Hey Harry, how was your summer?" asked Dean as Ron stared at him disapprovingly, his dislike clearly being because Dean was still going out with his sister Ginny. "It was all right," said Harry, trying to make his summer a non-issue. "That's great," replied Dean, obviously using the holiday question as a means of starting the conversation. "Anyway, I was wondering if you were going to continue the Defense Association this year?" Immediately both Ron and Hermione lit up in anticipation, as whilst during the summer it was a non-issue, it was now the school year and they both wanted to continue. Harry looked at them both and then turned to Dean, who was bouncing up and down on his feet with excitement. "Well, I haven't thought about it, but I don't see why not," he said, also wanting to continue it on. He'd enjoyed teaching everyone last year and would love to do it again this year. "That's great," said Dean before shooting off. Dean was gone far too quickly for Harry or the other two to say goodbye. "We'll have to organize a meeting this week and find out who is still interested in the Defense Association and when the next session will be," said Hermione. "You can sort that out, Hermione. Harry and I have a Quidditch meeting to organize," replied Ron, obviously not wanting the D.A to take precedence over the Quidditch team. "You better not think I'm doing it alone. You two are just as responsible for this group as I am," retorted Hermione bitterly. The trio ascended the final staircase and stood in front of the fat lady portrait that allowed access to the Gryffindor common room for all those that said the correct password. "Chocolate sundae," said Hermione quickly. The portrait nodded in approval and opened to reveal the doorway to the Gryffindor common room. All three of them climbed through and into the common room. The common room was filled with students, chatting and talking amongst themselves. They ignored the presence of Harry, Hermione, and Ron. The seats surrounding the burning fireplace were naturally taken, so the three of them were resigned to seating themselves in a quiet corner, which seemed cold and poorly lit. Although none of them could really care, they just wanted to sit down and continue their conversation. "So Harry, when do you want to have the first Quidditch meeting?" asked Ron, clearly trying to get Harry setting a date for the Quidditch before setting a date for the DA. "You can organize that at any time this week, Ron," said Hermione, trying to prevent Ron from ousting the D.A from the conversation. "The Defense Association is clearly more important." "Really?" said Ron sardonically. "Yes, really, Quidditch is just a pointless game. The D.A could save our lives," said Hermione strongly. "A pointless game?" retorted Ron vehemently. "Quidditch isn't pointless, it entertains people. The world needs entertaining, you know." Harry didn't want to get involved in the conversation. It was bad enough as it is that his two friends were arguing, but the fact they were arguing over two things that were his responsibility and not theirs was even worse. It didn't help that he won responsibility that was even more important than the both of them combined: vanquishing the Dark Lord Voldemort. Whilst both Hermione and Ron realized that Harry was under a great amount of pressure and was dealing with things that they couldn't even comprehend, they didn't know that he knew something that would scare the life out of both of them. "Well, entertain them then, but unless we start the D.A back up quickly, we could lose time in preparing for the war with Voldemort," replied Hermione. "What good is Harry teaching everyone to defend himself when they're no match for the Death Eaters?" said Ron, trying so hard to make Quidditch seem more important, though deep down he knew otherwise. He was just too stubborn to show it. "Don't be so stupid, Ron," said Hermione bitingly. "It doesn't just help everyone else when Harry teaches them, it helps him too." "But Quidditch doesn't get the aid of defense against the dark arts lessons, now does it?" responded Ron, a certain smugness falling over him. "But what about those who aren't doing defense against the dark arts this year?" responded Hermione, clearly not about to lose to Ron in a battle of wits. "What, the two people that didn't take the Defense Association last year?" said Ron quickly. "Everyone that were in the Defense Association passed defense against the dark arts last year, even with stupid Umbridge trying to unteach us." "But Ron, you don't have to prepare for wars in Quidditch, it's only a game," said Hermione, almost pleading with Ron. "Anyway, you haven't even got a full team, which is exactly why we need to sort this out." "Be quiet, both of you," roared Harry suddenly, cutting out Ron, who looked at him confused. Hermione was taken aback with shock as Harry sat, his head pounding. "Why are you arguing? What does it matter? It's only a couple of meetings, it's not a matter of life or death." "It doesn't matter." "But Harry, we're only trying to help." "Is that it, Hermione? You're only trying to help? Well, you're not helping, are you?" said Harry, calmer than his outburst but still seething inside. I don't need you two arguing over what meeting should come first. I have too much to deal with. Like the prophecy. Immediately Harry fell silent. He knew he just opened a whole can of worms he hadn't hoped he would for a while yet. What prophecy? Asked Ron inquisitively. Harry leaned back in his seat and knew that he'd have to tell them now. It wouldn't work if he tried to ward them off with excuses. He'd let the cat out of the bag. Oh, I might as well tell you, said Harry, lowering his volume so that no one else in the common room would hear him. His outburst had caused a few people to pause momentarily to look in his direction, and the dormitories weren't safe as anyone could walk in there and listen in. Take your time, Harry, said Hermione softly. Harry slowly but surely began to tell them about his meeting with Professor Dumbledore last June, about the prophecy and everything that Professor Dumbledore had told them. Neither Hermione nor Ron said a word. They just sat patiently listening to every single word that Harry said. It took almost an hour for Harry to get through it all. This wasn't due to the sheer amount of information but due to the hardship he had in physically talking about the prophecy. Neither Hermione or Ron were quick to say anything as soon as Harry had finished telling them everything. They just sat aghast as it dawned on them that Harry was the one that would have to kill the Dark Lord. But it could be Neville, though? Said Ron first. Dumbledore said he could have been the one. But Neville wasn't marked the Dark Lord's equal, responded Hermione. But the prophecy might be slightly wrong. No one has ever said prophecies are always correct, responded Ron, trying to alleviate some of Harry's burden. That is true, but if that was so, then Harry would have died when you know who fired the Avada Kedavra curse at him, responded Hermione, clearly not trying to ruin Ron's attempts but merely acting as a cool head. Harry turned away from Ron and Hermione as he noticed Neville getting up from his seat rather quickly and almost sprinting up the stairs to the dormitories. However, before Neville had exited, Harry caught a glimpse of a strange stare that Neville was giving him, one that seemed to signify fear, worry, and vindication in one expression. Harry couldn't explain why he turned to look at Neville. He knew that it wasn't because he was eavesdropping. He was far too far away to hear anything, and if he could lip read, he wouldn't have got much as all three of them were covered by shadows. Harry didn't feel the need to say anything to the other two who were busy dissecting the prophecy and trying to figure out what it all meant. But why did Dumbledore take so long to tell you, Harry? Said Hermione. It doesn't make any sense. Holding on to it for so long would only hurt you. He told Harry why. He didn't think he was ready for it yet, responded Ron. No, said Harry, butting in, there is something else. I can't put my finger on it, but there is something else. Something that is worrying him. What do you think it is? Said Ron. I don't know, I really don't know, said Harry, now looking around the common room, which was emptying quickly. The three of them talked for another hour before finally departing for bed. Harry and Ron trudged up the short staircase to the sixth-year boys' dormitory and entered the eerily quiet dormitory and went off to each other's beds. They said the typical good nights and both disappeared behind the curtains of their beds and lay their heads to sleep. Harry could hear Ron fall off to sleep quickly. He was quiet, and then every so often a random phrase would rupture the air around his bed. It didn't bother Harry. He'd known Ron for so long that it became a nice novelty that seemed to help Harry fall asleep. However, tonight Harry would need all the help he could muster. It was tough trying to close your eyes when thoughts of facing Voldemort permeated your head. It became increasingly worse as Voldemort seemed to taunt Harry, taunting him about his parents, Sirius, and everything else that Harry had caused directly or indirectly. Of course, this wasn't a nightmare of Voldemort invading his dreams. This was Harry's mind dealing with all the pain and anguish Harry had felt. This was his mind's way of reminding him about everything. It wasn't pretty, and Harry would never wish for anyone else to ever be subjected to these thoughts of unimaginable pain and darkness. This was the downside to all of his fame. This was his life. This was Harry Potter, the boy who lived. A boy born through a life of never-ending peril and danger. A boy born through the hopes of the world, and yet he felt neither hopeful or remotely special. He felt cursed. If it wasn't for his friends and everyone that helped him, Harry wondered if he would even be living today. A cold, deathly mist gripped the lifeless countryside of North Hertfordshire, its once idyllic surroundings now encapsulated in a dark abyss of which seemed no escape. A forceful wind blew the mist through the small village of Hinksworth. Its ever-increasing size sifted through the gardens of the Tudor-style houses, their white and black decor quickly becoming almost indecipherable as the Black Knight pulled them into its grasp. Footsteps could be heard from the distance. The steps were methodical and well-spaced, coming from a figure that seemed to enjoy savoring every step as if he hadn't walked for years. Louder and louder they grew as the figure seemed to appear from out of the dark void of the world around them. The figure was adorned in a long swaying black silky cloak, which wavered with every step and was engulfed by the stern wind. The oversized hood hid the figure's head, leaving just a black hole that would show the pearly whites of the figure's eyes whenever the weak light there was managed to break the shadows that consumed him. The figure finally stopped outside of a small cottage that had long since been abandoned. Its windows were boarded up with old rotten pieces of wood that had spent far too many years at the mercy of the elements. The figure turned to the doorway to the house, and with the flick of his wrist the door slammed open violently, its hinges almost buckling under the sheer force. Without a single moment's hesitation, the figure walked slowly through the doorway and into the dilapidated house. The inside of the house was even worse than the outside. Its walls were stripped of all wallpaper or paint, leaving a beige-colored rough surface that was cracked, and in some places had holes which went all the way through. The floors were just as bare, with the rotting floorboards either wet or broken from neglect or most likely termites. The figure walked through to what would once have been the lounge. It was like the rest of the house, ruined from neglect and abuse. Large fireplace sat at the other end of the room, its metal framework rusted through, the walls that held it cracked immeasurably. Surprisingly, it housed a burning fire, the orange flames flickering quickly as it let off a shallow orange glow that lit the room enough so that a second person could be seen tied up in the corner adjacent to the fire. That person was Harry Potter. His body was laced with cuts and bruises, his face covered in dirt and the smears of dried tears, his glasses bent and cracked. It was evident that he'd been here for quite a while. His arms had dried crusted blood that had seeped from the wounds of the ropes that tightly tied him. He was a far cry from the exuberant young boy that uses to frolic and play with his friends at Hogwarts, the enthusiastic student that would joke and laugh during lessons, and the boy that had held all hope for the wizarding world. The cloaked figure walked towards Harry and lowered his hood to reveal himself as the malevolent Dark Lord Voldemort. His cold, heartless eyes stared at Harry's prone body as a wry grin escaped from his mouth. He lowered his body so that his head was at the same height as Harry's. "Oh, how the mighty have fallen," he said, smirking. "The great savior of the wizarding world is tied up and at my mercy. Oh, I couldn't have wished for a better present." Harry looked into Voldemort's emotionless eyes and spat at him. "You better kill me now," he said courageously. "Oh, my dear boy, I wouldn't dream of killing you yet," replied Voldemort, unaffected by Harry's valiant effort to defy him. "You have much to tell me." Harry turned his gaze away from Voldemort, who had moved to within inches of Harry, his cold and unrelenting breath causing the hairs on Harry's arms to stand on end. Harry felt his stomach wrench as Voldemort smelt Harry's pain and then laughed loudly. "Tell me, Harry, what was it like to be my eyes? What was it like to betray Albus Dumbledore without even knowing?" asked Voldemort with a sadistic tone. Harry just closed his eyes and tried to ignore Voldemort's piercing words. "Oh, you can try and hide from the fact that it was you that ended their plight, you can try and escape it, but you can't. It will live with you for the last remaining moments of your pointless existence. It was through you that I learnt about everything. The prophecy, Dumbledore's plans, your pathetic army," said Voldemort, his hand reaching towards Harry's face. "Look at me," roared Voldemort, his hand now grasped upon Harry's chin, squeezing it tightly before turning Harry's face towards Voldemort's. Harry struggled to turn away again, but he was too weak for Voldemort, who was enjoying watching Harry squirming. "I've always wondered why, when the whole world fears me, that you do not. I've spent hours in your head trying to find an answer, but with no success. Enlighten me, Harry. Enlighten me on why you do not fear the great Lord Voldemort." Harry looked Voldemort straight in the eyes and then, without struggling, calmed himself down. "What is there to fear from a wizard who tries to destroy all Muggle-born and half-bloods when he himself is a half-blood? You're just like the rest of them." "Enough!" shouted Voldemort, his hand squeezing Harry's jaw so tightly that Harry's mouth seemed to shut almost immediately. "I have had enough of your pestilence, your lies, and of your devotion to the true enemy on wizard-kind Albus Dumbledore. You shall suffer for an eternity." Voldemort released Harry and then stepped back into the far end of the room, into the shadows, as the fire suddenly stopped burning as the room seemed to get excruciatingly cold. Harry's breath turned into a white vapor as it suddenly dawned on Harry that his worst nightmare was going to take him. Stood floating in the doorway were 3 large Dementors, their black cloaks swaying slowly as they approached Harry. Their spindly hands outreached, thoughts of Albus Dumbledore being killed in cold blood. His mother's death rushed through Harry's head. He felt like he was being consumed by his worst nightmares, each one becoming more vivid and unrelenting. Then it happened. The central Dementor swooped, and before Harry could move, cold skeleton-like lips clasped onto his, and Harry felt his life rush from out of him. Every memory seemed to leave him as the Dementor continued to kiss him, and then black. Harry awoke sharply. He was drenched in sweat, and the images of his nightmare, hallucination or whatever seemed to stay with him. It was so vivid, so realistic that Harry was sure it was happening, and then it hit him. He knows.